And welcome to episode 5 of the Retro Critical Podcast for June 2016, and we've got a nice variety of topics this month. I've entitled this podcast A Millennial's Lament, and I'm going to look at some of the highs and lows of the hobby here in 2016 from the perspective of someone who grew up in gaming, so to speak. We're going to talk about the delay of No Man's Sky, which I think says something fairly interesting about the state of the industry. We're going to look at the launch debacle of the GTX 1080 and 1070, but also point out some positives that this new hardware might do for gaming in general, of course specifically PC gaming. We will ask the question of whether and to what extent certain game genres have actually gotten better with time and are actually better than their iterations and appearances on retro consoles. We're going to talk about E3. I'm going to give some predictions for this year and also look back at the history of E3 and ask what are the top 5 most historic, most eventful E3 conventions. This month in gaming is going to focus on June of 2001 and the kind of changing landscape that period in gaming represented. I've got some interesting sports games for Games of the Month, and interesting commentaries, news, and views scattered throughout. So it's going to be fun, I think, an enjoyable podcast, as always. But before we move on, I want to end this introductory segment by talking about introductory segments on podcasts. And this is a pet peeve that I've had for a really long time. It is actually one of the reasons why I've designed this podcast the way I do. And basically, I enjoy listening to video game podcasts on the way to work. It's something that I did back with the All Gen Gamers when that was still running. And there's nothing better than to sort of come up upon a weekend and drive to work and listen to something fun. Listening to something about retro gaming. And I don't always listen to podcasts, or at least just sort of gaming podcasts on the way to work. Sometimes I listen to nothing. I refuse to listen to the radio. And then sometimes I listen to kind of things of professional interest or podcasts of professional interest. But you need a break, and video gaming podcasts give you that. This week, the podcast sort of professional recordings that I listened to kind of dried up. There was nothing new out there. And the usual gaming podcasts that I listen to, Retro Gaming Roundup, the Pat Contry's podcast, Completely Unnecessary Podcast, no new episodes. I do also listen to Johnny Millennium and Alpha Omega Sin, very, very good podcast that they do, although released very intermittently. And I figured it's been a long time since I've searched for other podcasts. So I do search, retro gaming, and I see a whole bunch of different interesting looking podcasts, interesting topics, yes, interesting little album art, and I just download a bunch of them, subscribe to a bunch of them, just figured maybe I'll find a gem. And I'm driving, I'm going to a different office, so I have a little bit of a longer trip, and I'm stuck in traffic. Huge construction on this particular route that I was taking. So I figured fire up the podcasts, and each and every one of them, I can't even remember their names, honestly, because I deleted them so quickly, but every podcast had an introductory segment where the hosts would come on and quote-unquote be random. They were being random, sort of telling random jokes, random anecdotes that I assume they feel their audience would enjoy. It took them, in some cases, 25 minutes to get in to the gaming content of the podcast. And this is a sickness that so many different podcasts and even YouTube channels have. I don't understand why you can't just start a podcast with a little brief overview of what you're going to do and launch into the material. I'm not here I was trying to see if I can remember what they were talking about. One of them started off saying it was a girl and a couple guys, and they were riffing on the girl's decision to buy a motorcycle rather than a PlayStation 4. And this went on for 20 minutes. Nothing to do with the PlayStation 4 itself, just, well, dude, how much was your leather jacket? How much was your helmet? How much was your, on and on and on. And then something about crocheting Mario, just abysmal, absolutely abysmal. Another one started off by talking about chili dogs. They spent a good 15 minutes talking about the difference between a chili dog and a hot dog with gravy. So, yeah, that was completely unenlightening. Not in the context of any particular game. They just started off with that. What were the others? Some of them were just sort of like bad, going back and forth, guy talk, toilet humor, that sort of thing. I don't know why people do this. I don't know. I mean, and tell me honestly, is this funny? Is this what you want to listen to? I mean, some of these had interesting topics. The history behind Gunstar Heroes. Oh, I'd love to actually learn about that. I do not know much about Gunstar Heroes, and I couldn't get to it. It is, and the jokes are so similar. Every one of these supposedly random riffs that all these different podcasts do are very similar in the kind of humor that they present. This kind of sarcastic, quirky, hipster humor, and it's the point where if everyone is making a sarcastic quip about everything, you actually have no idea what anyone believes, because they're just going back and forth, and I actually think it's a substitute for a lack of ideas, and I find that troubling. I'm not saying that to be condescending, because actually, and I didn't listen to these particular podcasts long enough, but in the past, when you actually start listening to these people talk about games, whether it's the history of the games or their history with games, it's actually a pretty good listen, and they're actually insightful. So I just don't understand why you can't. You don't have to be serious all the time. You can interject some humor here or there, but why can't you start a podcast with some substance? I know it's a very popular deal. Or how about this? This is another one that I almost forgot. The product placement. The product placement, the kind of ironic, goofy product placement. So, guys, I want to talk about Mega Man, but you know it's also a mega deal? And then some bullshit Dollar Save Club nonsense. Cannot stand that. Hey, you want to monetize your podcast? That's fine, but don't start out with that placement. Intersperse it throughout the podcast. So, anyway, that's a long-winded introduction on why I hate podcast introductions, and now let's get started with episode 5 of the Retro Critical Podcast. So let's talk a little bit about No Man's Sky. This was a fairly controversial bit of news that came up, and that is No Man's Sky has been delayed until August 9th. I believe it was supposed to come out either at the end of June or early July, and of course this is a game that is quickly becoming a kind of vaporware. It's been talked about now, I think, since E3 2014, and of course just looks absolutely brilliant, a tremendous idea, and something that was really supposed to harness the power of the 8th console generation. It was then subsequently announced for PC. But it seems like we have the kind of interesting set of opinions that always comes along with a delay notification. You have, of course, this simple binary, which basically says, okay, great, it's delayed, they're going to make it better, and then the utter outrage, and then opinions falling somewhere in the middle. And I would say I kind of lean towards the negative end of the spectrum. Yes, I think it's great that they're not rushing it out the door, but I think these constant delays often are harbingers of a product that is flawed in some way, and that is really not going to live up to the dreams that the players kind of set for themselves as they kind of go through the hype cycle. So let's look at some other games that have had this kind of a process, this kind of a delay. And I mean, of course, there's so many. It's nowadays it's really hard to pinpoint any 3 or 4 that are emblematic of this problem. But of course, since it's also coming out at some point this summer, we can mention Mighty Number 9, which morphed from this overwhelmingly positive, really, event when they announced that and everyone got behind it, to something that has changed drastically between the initial concept art when Concept announced it until now, which they just released a trailer for it. People were up in arms. I think for the art style, to me the art style looked okay, although it wasn't the hand-drawn art that we saw, I guess, in the initial couple of screenshots, but for its crappy announcer. So, there's a project that is completely lost whatever mindshare that it had when it was announced. I'll actually look back to the Assassin's Creed games set in Paris, and there are so many of them, so many Assassin's Creed games. I don't know what that was called, Unity maybe, but when they announced that, just this incredible, vibrant city with more NPCs and more buildings, and it was just going to be this incredible, absolutely wonderful Assassin's Creed like we've never seen. And what happened, it was a buggy mess that I think on the Xbox One didn't even work properly for the first couple of weeks. Another game, the 1866, that sort of steampunk game that came out for the PlayStation 4, that was touted as this just amazing cinematic experience, quote unquote. What did it become? A kind of quick, shallow game that everyone absolutely abandoned, it seemed, after the first couple of weeks. And then, of course, talk about abandonment, Titanfall, a game that was going to revolutionize the first-person shooter genre. And what happened? It was a poor concept as far as the content that they gave you. You just had the multiplayer, and the community, the shooting community, I guess, left that within a month, it seemed like. Although I think Titanfall was actually a very good game mechanically, but its business model was just insanely flawed. We go back to, I guess, was it E3 2012 or 2013 with Watch Dogs and what they promised there, and kind of the graphics that you saw on, I think, that first PC trailer to what it became. Again, I can go on and on. And I think when you have these continual delays matched with continual hype, it serves no one. I would actually like to get to a point, or just sort of change the media cycle around how games are announced. And I understand E3 has traditionally been a big event, although in fairness it's been shrinking for the past couple of years. But instead of announcing something and saying, hey, this will be out 3-4 years from now, announce things that are going to be purchasable within 6 months' time. And if they're not, don't mention them and don't hype them. Now, I know the clickbait nature of games journalism today means that if you know a game is in development, you want to be the first to talk about it. But I would argue that overall, this is good for no one. It's not good for the manufacturer who feels the need to get that good press and then feels the need to perhaps deliver a game that's incomplete and to be kind of rushed in coming out with whatever they're developing. And I think that does affect game quality to a degree. Of course, there are other sort of financial cycle elements that go into that as well. It doesn't serve the media outlets because eventually, if they're constantly talking and hyping a game that you know you're not going to play anytime soon, at least I've gotten to the point where, why am I going to read it? Why do I care? If it's not something that I know is down the road and I know I can get my hands on it, to me it's just meaningless chatter in the superficial ether that is a lot of games media today. And of course, based on this reaction that I'm presenting here, it doesn't serve the players, because one of the fun aspects of being a gamer, particularly certainly in the mid-90s, but at the beginning of the internet era when there wasn't such an extended hype cycle, if they were talking about a game, you could usually get your hands on it pretty quickly. And I think we have some evidence within gaming and outside of gaming that a quick turnaround time really creates some passionate, fanatical fans and users of the software. Let's look within gaming. We'll look at Blizzard. And I think Blizzard, I'm not a huge fan of their games, but it seems like with this Overwatch thing, I heard about it about 6 months ago. They did a beta at that point, and here it is. You can buy the full product. They release things when they're ready. Same thing with StarCraft. Again, I'm not a huge StarCraft player, so maybe they announce the expansion packs sooner than 6 months, but it seems like you hear about them, and then within 6 to 8 months, they are there, and they're not rushing things out the door. It seems like a lot of what they do is of pretty high quality upon release. I think to a degree you have Grand Theft Auto operating like that too. I would say probably the hype cycle for that was maybe closer to a year, but it wasn't. I don't remember it being constant. And of course, Rockstar, for their part, they are certainly not driven by a yearly or quarterly release cycle. They come out with something when it's ready. But let's look outside of gaming, or at least outside of the software. GTX 1080 announced on, I think, May 7th and purchasable on May 27th. Even though that was just for one version of the card, there are many others coming out. But basically, from announcement to the end of June, pretty much the whole sort of custom vendor line of those cards will be available. So it creates hype. I was hyped about it. In fact, I was planning on getting one on the 27th of May, but I couldn't get to order it until later in the day, and they were all sold out, but so be it. Pick up one of the custom vendor models. Anyway, other examples, Apple. It seems like whenever they do one of their conferences somewhere, they're announcing a product, it's coming out pretty quickly, within a month's time, or certainly within 6 months' time. So, again, it's not a popular idea that I'm presenting here to change the way that games media and the publishers and developers work with each other, but I would consider it because if you read through the comments on No Man's Sky, in between those two poles of complete acceptance and complete anger, you had some people who are like, look, it's not going to be that good, it's just going to be a procedurally generated shooter, and it's going to get very boring. And it's the type of thing that, and that wasn't just one comment, that was a number of them that kind of had that tone, and that's the kind of apathy that I think can be generated by constantly hyping, setting a date, delaying the date. I think it's a dangerous precedent. Obviously, it has not hurt games media. It has not hurt publishers and developers thus far. But I think if it becomes the standard, if it becomes what people accept, again, you're going to get into the situation, why do I care about the games journalist writing about these games that I know I'm not going to play anytime soon? And why would I have any trust in these developers if they constantly push this back? What does it mean? Is this a decent product? Can I put my money elsewhere and just wait to see what the fallout is when the thing is released? I think it would be better for everyone if this practice and this media cycle just changed to benefit everyone in that equation, as opposed to pissing everyone in that equation off. Well, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here. I was really angry this week. A couple of interactions that I had on YouTube really kind of pissed me off. And I don't know, I've been kind of down on the whole social media thing. And, you know, I just, I'm getting less and less tolerant of the superficiality that we encounter online and the way people react to you if you say something a little bit critical and a little bit different. So what set me off this week? Well, I was just looking through my subscription feed. Busy week, came home late, wanted to just unwind with YouTube. And turned on Giant Bomb. I don't know what they were doing. They were doing kind of a live stream. And I was so irritated by what I saw. I don't watch a lot of Giant Bomb these days, and I'll preface this by saying I was always a fan of Jeff Gerstmann. I would read his stuff really at the birth of GameSpot, and I was so excited as a kid when GameSpot came out, and I had AOL or whatever it was in the mid to late 90s, and I could read about video games online. I didn't have to buy the magazine. Jeff's stuff was terrific. It was clear, it was concise. You got the sense that he was a really passionate player, and I followed him ever since, from GameSpot to Giant Bomb, and I guess technically back to into the GameSpot family or something, or CBS Media bought them. Anyway, doesn't matter. So the problem I have with Giant Bomb these days is that it takes them forever to get to the point. They do this, there are a couple guys in the room. A lot of them, I hate to say it, have significantly less talent than Jeff and the late Ryan Davis and Alex Navarro and kind of the original group. And you know who they are if you watch them, these newer guys. And they just sit there and they cackle and yuck it up about some hipster in-jokes that I could care less about. I want to actually see the games. I want to actually hear their opinion on these games. Because I think when they cut out the entertainment bullshit, they're actually pretty good. So I'm sitting there and I can't do it. I'm skipping ahead. I'm like 45 minutes into this 3-hour stream, and I said, you know what? Fuck it. I can't listen to this anymore. I can't listen to it. So I wrote, what exactly did I write? I'm too lazy to call it up, but I think I said something like, oh boy, I wish I could be as with it and as hip as these guys. Oh, their humor is so meta. And oh man, the flack that I got from defenders. Now, was it a friendly comment? Was it something that I felt good about doing? No, but I was pissed off. I reacted. But people were appalled at that I could ever insult the video gaming gods over at Giant Bomb. And all this hate was coming in. Oh, I'm trying to promote my channel with this. Oh, you suck. You have the worst YouTube channel in the world. Screw you. And of course, and this doesn't speak well of me, I engaged with some of them, and I did say some pretty mean things to one of these guys, a restaurateur from New York. And if you really have a successful restaurant, why are you going back and forth in a trolling battle on YouTube? Anyway, but then, you know what? I said, okay, I'm not going to do this. One guy called me out, and he was like, you're supposed to be this relaxed, friendly, sort of analytical voice, and you're getting all upset. And I said, okay, fair enough. I'm going to stop. Okay, I'm going to stop with this. And it ended. But it was just amazing how people just defend these quote-unquote personalities when some of the stuff they do literally sucks. And I could say that, and I've criticized people that I really look up to on YouTube, and I'll throw out a name. Really the person that got me into making videos on YouTube, and that was Johnny Millennium. Tons of respect for him, but when they did the whole Final Bosses thing in one of my Game Escape Update Not Safe for Work editions, I kind of criticized the whole idea, saying that they were probably going to ultimately monetize that site and try to pull in the audience over from YouTube and sell some bullshit merchandise and all that. So I was critical of him and his buddies. I've been critical. One time I criticized, not really Metal Jesus, but, well, I did criticize Metal Jesus for shilling some sort of a product, and he got all offended at me, as did his fans. But we got over that, and then I criticized someone for, I guess, giving him Earthbound, just donating Earthbound to him, and so this, I don't want to go into that. You could read that on the pickup video where he's kissing Earthbound. I still get comments about what I wrote on that thing. That was about 2 years ago. So I just don't understand why we can't tolerate other opinions. Why do we have to just sort of follow along with whatever these personalities say? They're becoming, we almost have like a fanboyism towards these online personalities now. And boy, if you're not in direct support of them, oh man, you're a nothing. Oh, you're a failure. You're not on board with, pull out a name, of Alpha Omega Sin. Oh boy, who cares? I mean, at least listen to what people have to say. And I'm not a big YouTuber, but I do read the majority. I read all of my comments, and the good and the bad, and I engage with the good and the bad. It's the difference of opinion that's actually interesting. It's not everyone, being a mouthpiece for certain talents or outlets. Absolutely frustrating. And then another thing happened. I went on to Reddit, and I was excited about the GTX 1080 and the new custom versions of that, and I went on to a subreddit called PC Gaming. And I asked them, what was my question? I said, oh, guys, what do you think? Do you know when they're going to release the custom partner boards? Is it, here's my setup. You think I should go with the Founders Edition or wait? Do you know the release dates? The difference in release dates? I was attacked, but I was strongly reprimanded by the moderators for asking a build question. And they said, didn't you read the rules? Didn't you read the rules? No, I didn't read the rules. I was pressed for time, and I was excited about a topic, and I went to a Reddit called PC Gaming. And I asked a question about a gaming component for the PC. I didn't think that I was treading too heavily against the rules. But that's happened to me a million times on Reddit. I'll tell you, Reddit's got a lot of rules for a site that specializes in fucking cat memes, okay? Look, if I asked a PC gaming question on, I don't know, Data is Beautiful or something like that, yeah, okay, that's overstepping the bounds. But PC gaming, build a PC, so you got to ask PC Master Race, you got to ask this subreddit or that subreddit. Just answer a question that's within your area of competence. Same thing happens on the retro gaming subreddit. Boy, I've stepped on some toes there. because I posted my own things a couple times, or what did I do? I offended them in some way. I posted an article that, oh, we've seen that already. All right, well then fucking don't read it, okay? Move on. What's the point? People are so touchy, and I actually went on and I created my own subreddit called Chill Gamer, and I've been posting absurd rules. You can find it on my Twitter. You can go to that. I mean, I didn't realize you needed a list of divine commandments to be able to ask a question about video games. Just very frustrating, and I think it's to the detriment of social media. Why can't people be genuinely controversial and listen or don't listen? Why is everyone so touchy? I mean, people on a couple of my videos, the Mahjong videos, the one about the arcade sticks, a couple of them that have over 20,000 views, which for me is a real, that's success. I've answered questions numerous times. Yeah, I'm not getting 1,000 a day, but even on Reddit, I'll post something, and sometimes the times that people do respond, yeah, I'll answer questions. I don't get this sort of classism that has invaded this hobby. It never used to be like that. YouTube, I felt like at one point it was a genuine discussion, and I feel bad that I didn't think to get in then. But I don't get the criticism, and I feel like the critical voices that you hear are, the criticism is part of the act. Alpha Omega Sin, who, when he's not ranting and raving and cursing, actually very, very good listen on the podcast that he does with Johnny Millennium, on his channel. But when you're throwing out 60 million F-bombs and doing the metalhead stuff, it's an act. Another guy who is supposedly really tough and really critical is that, what is his name? Boogie something, 988 or something like that. And this guy, who strikes me as a good guy, and I get that he uses his insecurities and his appearance to get views, but when he's talking about games, he can be listenable and entertaining. But he always takes this line, I'm going to call it like I see it. I'm going to call it like I see it. What does he do? He panders to everyone. PlayStation and Xbox, I'm going to call it like I see it. I'm going to call it like I see it. Well, 900p isn't so bad on the Xbox One, and Xbox Live and PSN are great. They're both great. Oh man, I'm really shooting off the cuff here. They're both awesome in their own way. I mean, that counts as criticism, but God forbid you throw some valid criticism at people and they take it the wrong way. And the result is, and this is not every viewer, this is not directed at my listeners, this is not directed at people at my YouTube channel or personalities on YouTube. Specifically, this next statement is very general. I think generally what's happening is you're having these bigger personalities become pitchmen. They're pitchmen for their own content, and then they're literally pitching various things under the guise of being real and authentic. And, this particular product placement is going to be goofy, so listen to it, and you'll laugh. Fuck off, okay? I'm not laughing. All right, you want to have a product play? Tell me about the product, okay? Tell me why I should want this. And if it's like Loot Crate and it's a monthly shipment of shit that no one needs, okay, don't beat around the bush. It's you either like it or you don't. Don't turn it into a joke that I'm supposed to laugh at and then secretly buy into. So you have these big shot pitchmen types that are dominating a lot of YouTube, and then you have classism amongst the fans. Who can be the biggest sycophant out there? I mean, I find it so irritating. Like the people who post, I got my GameSack DVD. Here's me in front of my game collection and a picture of it. So your buddies can retweet it, and GameSack can retweet it. Hey, here's a shirt from, Retro Gaming whatever the fuck, okay? Here's my retro gaming t-shirt, okay, retweet. And I'm not just saying, oh, this is because no one pays attention to me. So many people have interesting things to say online about video games and a lot of other subjects, and they're just speaking white noise into the ether because no one will go slightly out of their comfort zone to pay attention to what they have to say. It is so fucking irritating. I don't know why this, I know why it's happened. It's all part of the online business model. And as I said before, if you try to make gaming into a small business, if this is your main source of income, you're going to sell out. To a certain extent, you're going to sell out because you want to do what's best for yourself financially, but it's what's best for your family. But you're not a cool, laid-back gamer at that point. And if you read all of the stuff, if you ever read someone's Patreon, any one of these guys, and I've criticized this on YouTube on my Patreon parody video, they're trying to make this their life's passion. They want to make this their full-time commitment. We should help them be awesome, and they're so thankful, and we don't we don't have to donate money. We're awesome, but if we really want to be awesome, we'll donate money. I mean, come on. Either be upfront about what you are, or stop doing this. I mean, and a guy who does this very successfully, I've said this a lot of times, Total Biscuit. He's upfront. He's in this to make money. He's very successful. His channel is incredibly profitable, very successful, and he also is an intelligent, critical voice who every time you listen to anything he puts out, he has a point. There is a reason for his videos, and that reason is 99.9% of the time expressed concisely and intelligently, and you learn something about the topic, even though he's being paid to show it to you. That is the definition of success. It's not some guy with long hair pretending that he cares about you and pretending that you're having some authentic interaction when they're just trying to fleece you. So I'm going to stop because I don't think that I've quite been this angry or this vocal online, and I've really tried. I'm in real life, quote unquote. I am kind of a misanthrope, and I can be quite negative. But I always said that for the online stuff, for the gaming stuff, I was going to try to always offer a professional, intelligent, analytical, but also kind of laid-back, relaxing take on gaming. And I was never going to sell out or sell things to you. Yeah, I monetize videos when I can, but I've never said, I'm not going to do this video because I can't monetize it. But I've never really gotten angry. And I would say this is not even me ranting and raving right now. But I can get a lot angrier. But I've never tried to put that foot forward because I didn't want to be the kind of guy who shits on everything for the sake of shitting on everything. So I'll leave it there and just leave it with the hope that at some point, whether it's in retro gaming or anything else, that eventually people make space for an intelligent exchange of critical dissenting ideas, and that you don't have to pile on people who have an opinion that differs from you. If you're uncomfortable with an opinion, say so, and say why. And actually, that makes the social networking aspect of this community more interesting. Stop kissing up to people. Stop going on trolling raids because you don't like what someone says because they insulted your favorite personality. It's infantile, it's silly, and it ruins this hobby. Well, it's June, so that means E3 is right around the corner. And I want to, of course, do a segment on what I'm looking forward to at E3, what are some of my wishes. But I wanted to start the segment by looking back at what happened last year. And I think as we move forward, E3 gets less and less interesting. I think it seemed like back when I was a bit younger, they would mention something at E3, and then it was purchasable pretty quickly thereafter, whether it was 3 months, 6 months out. That may have been a function of less media penetration and less hype than we have today, but it was nonetheless exciting always to hear what was right around the corner. It seems like as we've moved on, E3 has kind of become a cheerleading competition for basically your AAA yearly releases and then vaporware almost. That is so far off in the future, it may not well exist. And I think last year's E3 was a great example of that. We had a whole bunch of games talked about, and really the big announcements were for games that we haven't seen, and in some cases technologies that we haven't seen. And what we did get was your kind of average yearly releases, whether it was The Division, although that was a new IP, although very similar to other games, Tom Clancy's, I think, Rainbow Six, Madden, FIFA. I mean, Fallout 4 was kind of a big deal. That's not obviously a yearly release. They gave a lot of coverage to that. But a couple of the interesting things that I think really made news are things that we haven't seen. We had the Microsoft HoloLens demo, which looked absolutely amazing. Haven't heard anything on that. I guess Mirror's Edge is coming out. And then, of course, we had the PlayStation announcements of, what was that game? The Last Guardian. That was finally being released, or being made. Shenmue 3, No Man's Sky, Final Fantasy VII Remake. We have not seen anything about these games, save for a couple of trailers. I mean, could you imagine if they said, hey, we're doing a Final Fantasy remake, and by the way, you can buy it in August? Nothing like that. So I think everyone's saying, oh, well, last year's show, how could you possibly top last year's show? How about we top last year's show by introducing games that we can actually buy within or before the end of 2016? So that's kind of, I mean, even like Recore, which who knows what Concept is going to do. We still haven't gotten the Mega Man or whatever it's called, Mighty Number 9 title. Still hasn't come out yet, but that looked mildly interesting. But all these games that are mildly interesting, I want to play. And I don't care about the next Madden or the next FIFA. So with that in mind, what do I want out of this year's E3? I think from the Microsoft side, I would like to see some more exclusives. I would be perfectly happy with Forza Horizon 3. If they're working on that, that would be terrific. More info about maybe wheel support for the Forza game released for the PC. Since they're having this unified architecture at Microsoft, how about allowing PC components on the Xbox? That would be great. How about releasing Cuphead? That was a game that looked wonderful last year. I don't believe that has come out yet. And maybe something else, some surprise Microsoft property of old, or some kind of game that would just feel right on the Xbox. Unreal Tournament, like a modern version of the classic Unreal Tournament 2004 comes to mind, but that's sort of a pipe dream. I think what we will see, of course, is they will talk about whatever their Xbox One 4.5 is, or whatever their next Xbox is. I guess they could make a splash by announcing some really generous upgrade program that PlayStation hasn't done. That would be a great way to kind of build market share here at the second go-around, as it were, of releasing these consoles. Maybe saying that the Xbox Elite controller is now in stock. I don't know. That's expensive, but I know some people really wanted to get their hands on that. But beyond that, I don't see Microsoft. I actually like the Xbox One better than the PlayStation 4 this generation. It does have the better exclusives, but it feels rather barren. And certainly, obviously, if you're going to release these third-party games, they are usually better on the PlayStation 4. For the PlayStation 4 itself, I think we'll see a lot of Project Morpheus, or whatever they're calling it, PlayStation VR, probably get some demos, get a firm release schedule on that. Because I think they just said it was coming out maybe in October or November. I'd like to see some third-party content. How about some classic Sony franchises that we haven't seen in a while? I think and I've said this before in a number of different videos, what Sony, to me, this generation has just been very lazy for them. Hey, we've got the better hardware. We are too strapped for cash. We're too creatively barren to actually do anything with it. Third-party developers have at it. Indie developers have at it. I would like to see not an Uncharted or a Last of Us type thing, not a cinematic QuickTime adventure type game, but a return to form, even if it's something simple like when they did Twisted Metal on the PlayStation 3. I actually thought that was a pretty good game. Like maybe relaunch an old school franchise, something completely out of the blue, like a Jet Moto. I think a Jet Moto, new sort of shiny graphics, taking advantage of whatever hardware improvements are in the 4.5. That's something that I can get into. It probably would be pretty easy to do, but I don't really see a lot of big-time games on the horizon. Now, they may sort of come out with announcements like they did last year. Oh, Shenmue, Final Fantasy, but we probably won't see them for 10 years. I think it's actually a very disappointing platform. I don't know that there's anything they can tell me about the PlayStation Neo, or whatever they're calling it, 4.5, that is going to make me buy it. Unless, like I said, for Xbox, there's some trade-up. Hey, if you bought a PlayStation 4 within the past year, send it in, and we'll kind of give you this shiny new thing for $50, $60, $80, $100, maybe. But somehow I doubt it. So that's PlayStation. Nintendo. Obviously, they told us it's going to be about Zelda this year. Very disappointing. I would have liked to have seen something about the NX. I will not lie. I'm very interested to see what Zelda looks like, and I'd be very curious to see footage. Are they going to show us the NX footage? Are they going to show us the GameCube, the Wii U footage, and what is this world going to look like? I'd love to see this game in action. I have such high hopes for it. I think, as a Nintendo fan, I am very down on the Wii U right now. Obviously, it's coming to its end. I don't think they're going to announce any other significant titles, and I've honestly just been, whatever comes out, I buy, even if it's not particularly interesting, like Pokken Tournament. It's probably going to be one of the last Wii U games, so I picked it up. Haven't had a chance to jump into that. I'm going to, I think I pre-ordered, what is that thing about Fire Emblem Cross Persona? That's on the way, but if we could get one more game from Nintendo beyond Zelda for the platform, I would be excited. And I've said this for so many years. Official release of Earthbound 3, or Mother 3, whatever they're going to call it, that would be great. I think that would go a long way to winning back some fans who have been irritated for a long time that this great series has gotten very little love from Nintendo. Obviously, if they were ever to announce like a new Earthbound for the 3DS, that would be really exciting. They could throw in a curveball and say, well, we're not going to talk about the NX as far as it replacing the Wii U, but if it really is a dual-purpose device, they could surprise us by saying, well, this is how it's going to function in its handheld capacity, and talk about some new handheld games that are coming out, although I would like to see some other interesting 3DS releases. I haven't actually been following the 3DS release schedule all that closely, but definitely would like something where they'll say, hey, you can buy this after this Nintendo Direct presentation. And that goes for all developers and hardware manufacturers, you got to give us a couple things where, hey, this is coming out in 3 to 6 months. You will be able to buy it here in 2016. And by the way, if you want this is going to be out tomorrow. I always think that's fun, especially if it's something that looks interesting. It's a great way to generate an impulse buy on the part of your audience. One game that I am actually very excited about, and I really hope we get a firm release date and some more footage, is Tekken 7. Tekken 7 is something that I've been watching on Twitch, and I'm a complete sucker for fighting games. Obviously, I got duped by Street Fighter V. I bought it on the first day, and we all know how that worked out. But I would love for them to say, hey, we've got this new Tekken game. It's coming out. It has all the modes that you always had in Tekken, which is to say the Ghost Battle mode, the offline arcade mode, the local multiplayer, and great online multiplayer. And it would be wonderful to have that come out this summer. I know it's not going to happen, but I always feel like the summer is so barren for games. It would be great for them to say in mid-July, early August, this game is coming out. They did it with the Rare Replay, actually. And that was a highlight of my gaming summer last year. So something like that. I'd love it to be Tekken 7, but I just want to know that Tekken 7 is coming out in 2016. Now, Persona was just delayed for the U.S. until, 2016, I would like to see. Tekken. Persona 5 delayed until 2017. February 14th, 2017, Valentine's Day, cruel joke. For those of us who would like to get it on a launch and dig into it, probably the worst day of the year to release it, especially because I suspect if you fire it up that day, there's going to be some bonus, which would be really cruel, but also kind of funny. Like, you have to play this mission, or you have to go here on day one, and if you do that, some aspect of the game will unlock. I mean, they're cruel enough to release it on that day anyway. That would be kind of funny. So no expectations for that. Obviously, I mentioned Street Fighter V. I would love to know what their story mode is going to be, and I hope they say, oh, and with the story mode update, which maybe will drop right after E3, we will finally have an offline arcade mode just like we've always had. Same options that have been in the game since it was released on the Super Nintendo. And I guess I would say VR, my hope is that some franchise comes out and says, we are making the move to VR. Now that I have a VR-capable PC, and if I ever get one of these GTX graphics cards, 1000 series graphics cards, I will obviously be more than prepared. I just, as I look at the titles available, nothing catches my eye. No VR title looks interesting to me. So I want, obviously I've said this on a number of different podcasts before, I would love for it to be an Elder Scrolls game. Hey, the next Elder Scrolls is coming out on VR. Now, I realize it's such a massive game. That's not something where they're going to say, oh, it'll be out this Christmas. But at least announce it for VR. That will get me to purchase it. Maybe not right away, but it will certainly get me to purchase it. Another thing that would be very interesting is VR integration for a lot of the great PC racing titles. I realize that I think Project Cars has it, but to really optimize it, maybe for like Assetto Corsa, something like that, motorcycle game would be nice, Euro Truck Simulator, American Truck Simulator, like some good online or good PC racing game. Say we're going all out. It's going to be pure 3D. This is going to be a new driving experience. So you have your wheel set up. You put this on. I think that would be amazing. That would get me to jump on board. And probably, I've said this before, some kind of retro connection. I always thought it would be great to take an old school NES game and kind of simulate the art style in 3D. So you're walking through a Mega Man level in 3D, something like that. But even if it's not that, just having like the Genesis collection on Steam, just that front end in 3D, some sort of 3D front end for retro emulated games, and then you can just kind of see them like on a big screen. I think that would be good. Another thing that I think is really important for me to get into VR that I'd really love to see is the Vive specifically, because I do want to buy a Vive. I think this whole stuff with Oculus locking themselves down to their little storefront and not being compatible with Steam, and this kind of back and forth about, okay, we're now the Vive team or whoever's writing this interface says, okay, well now the Oculus games are compatible, then Oculus releases an update, and now they're not. That whole thing is really bad. So I will buy a Vive. I don't care that it costs a little bit more, but there has to be a reason for me to jump in, and I think for the Vive, aside from the games, from what I've seen about it, you really do have to have a lot of space, and standing up and having the controllers and moving around and interacting isn't really going to do it for me. I don't really want to do that. I don't have the space in the game room to do that, and I don't want to make the space because I have everything that I want in here. I have my PC set up. I've got my retro gaming center with all my systems. I've got this kind of PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 set up with some really nice little speakers attached to it. I don't want to take that all apart for the sake of 3D, and I don't want to move my gaming PC, so they'll really have to say that they have a mode or something, or an option where you can just put the headset on and use the controllers in your seat, or just use an Xbox One controller, something like that. Use your mouse and keyboard. I kind of think that is something that is necessary, because if you need a cavernous living room or something, it's not going to fly. I don't want to move anything into my living room for VR. Yeah, so beyond that, obviously you want the surprise, you want something that's unexpected, but again, I would like it to be unexpected, but I'd like to actually buy it this year. And a couple of summer releases would be great. We'll see what happens. I suspect progress will be, all those cool things they mentioned last year will get release dates this year. But yeah, I can't say that I'm just on the edge of my seat waiting for this. I think it has the potential to be largely disappointing. If you've been listening to this podcast or you've been following me on YouTube, you know that I am fairly critical of modern gaming. Modern games coming out in the past 3 or 4 years, plus the industry as a whole. But I wanted to step back from that position a little bit and ask myself, are there any good aspects about modern gaming? Can we say something positive about the way certain games and certain genres have developed? And it led me to the question, what genres have gotten better with time? I think we tend to focus on how good gaming was back in the 80s and 90s, and we have our favorite genres that we talk about, but if I just sort of pulled back and asked overall, which genres have actually improved? And in doing so, I kind of identified 3 categories of games. Games that I think are clearly better today in 2016. Genres that are better today. Genres that are definitely worse. And then some contested genres that we'll talk about. So, what genres have gotten better with time? I think the first genre you have to talk about is racing. Racing games have become markedly better than they ever were. I went back to the Genesis a couple of weeks ago and played Outrun, and then there was that sort of futuristic Outrun, and that pseudo 3D effect that you would have where it was just sort of this plane, infinite plane, and then you had the road that would slowly kind of scale left and right, and you get a couple of buildings in the background, a couple of road signs on the side of a road. I mean, there were numerous games like that. Those were terrible racing games. They just were not a lot of fun. Now, Outrun, the arcade game, was an incredible example of the genre, but a lot of the games you got on the home consoles were terrible, bordering on unplayable today. And if you look at how racing has evolved, and where did you go from there? You had stuff like Hard Drivin', which in itself is a bad game, but hey, it had the sort of stunts and roller coaster loops. You had Virtua Racing, which seemed very innovative. You had the Sega Saturn racers, like Sega Saturn, what do they call it, Rally Championship, something like that. Obviously Daytona, moving in to the Dreamcast. Daytona USA on the Dreamcast being a terrific game. Sega GT, Sega Rally 2, Tokyo Midnight Club, games like that. And, of course, then, obviously, Gran Turismo on the PlayStation 1, but also on the PS2, PS3. I mean, these are huge jumps in quality. And then you look today at games that are on the PC, and I guess consoles now as well. Project Cars, Assetto Corsa, the amount of feedback you get from a wheel if you're using a wheel, there is no comparison between the racing games that we have now and the ones we grew up with. I think this is a clear example of a genre that continues to get better and better. Another genre that I think is better, although less dramatically, is fighting games. And I say that because fighting games have always been solid. If you go back and you play Street Fighter 2, Super Street Fighter 2, these games still feel really good. The mechanics, the control schemes were, I think, pretty much formalized, and I don't want to say completely perfected, but they were brilliant back in the day. And you still have all of that today, and you have the great artwork and the great music, but I think the advent of online play, and I'm not a fan of online play, but I think if you step back and you can say, okay, we have the matchmaking lobbies, the spectating lobbies, just in many cases, the latency is such that you can actually have a good competitive online match. I think that resurrected the genre. It was an element that brought it back to the mainstream and actually expanded its appeal to a degree. So I want to say that fighting games needed that, and again, it pains me to say that because I hate online gaming, but I think that it was an innovation. It was an element of the modern game infrastructure that really helped that genre. And of course, now you can watch it on Twitch, and it's become a popular esport. And the quality of the games, forget about what happened with Street Fighter V, but the quality of the games has remained very consistent, very refined. So I think fighting games definitely belong in that better today category. Now, you have RTS games and turn-based strategy games that can just do more. I think the processing power that we have today allows Civ 5 to be something that you would have never gotten back in the day. Games like Supreme Commander or Planetary Annihilation, you compare that to Military Madness on the TurboGrafx 16. Military Madness on TurboGrafx 16 was a very good game, but just the battles that you could have in a Supreme Commander, or the planet hopping stuff, or just the planet geometry stuff that you have in Planetary Annihilation, on a totally different order. To say nothing of StarCraft and stuff like that, just which has those incredibly frenetic battles and online competition. That is something that I think has benefited that genre. Not to say that it's difficult to go back and play a Military Madness, a Warsong, a Final Fantasy Tactics, but I would say now, if you enjoy that concept, what is on offer now is incredibly more engaging. And then, like I said, turn-based Civ 5, a game to which I've dedicated probably 60, 70 hours, just huge, expansive with the Steam mods, and you can get the real-world maps and have, I don't know what the Civ limit is, maybe 15 civilizations in a game, plus all the nation-states. A lot of fun. Just and I would be remiss to forget the XCOM games as far as the sort of strategy shooter games that have come out. Also excellent. And I think the last genre that has gotten better, it's I think a clear one, first-person shooters. It is the popular genre these days, and they're significantly better. As iconic as the original Doom and Wolfenstein were, and how they would try to replicate that on a couple of the home systems, first-person shooters obviously have come a long way, even from games that I really liked, like Unreal Tournament 2004, which is a brilliant game. Today, if you like that genre, obviously online play, incredible graphics, series like Call of Duty and Battlefield that have really established themselves as these perennial heavyweights in this division, they're better games. Now, I don't particularly like them, and I think I would probably have just as much fun going back to Unreal Tournament 2004, but I can't deny that huge progress has been made, and I suspect if you are a hardcore first-person shooter player, you're not going to go back to the mid-2000s, and you're certainly not going to go back, and probably, if you didn't grow up with Doom or Wolfenstein, you're not going to be able to play those games. So those are the genres that I think are better. I think the genres that are clearly worse are JRPGs and platformers. JRPGs and platformers, to me, they were the late 80s, early 90s, and those games are so much better than what is being offered today. You know, whether it's the Metroidvania, retro-inspired platformers that are predominating the landscape in Steam, to me they're very, in a lot of cases, lazy, very kind of samey type experiences. And as I've said in many other forums, they offer the kind of illusion of innovation, but they're very, very derivative. And yeah, I can't really think of an indie platformer that rivals much of what we saw in the 16-bit era, 32-bit era, and even the 8-bit era. Now, I'm targeting that critique at the indie games, but there have been good platformers, games like the recent Kirby game on the 3DS was very good. So, I mean, Nintendo are making those sorts of games, although I've always said they're still holding to those old classic design choices. So I think there's an argument, you know, are these modern, quote-unquote, 2D platformers, or are they classic 2D platformers on new platforms? That's a discussion for a different day. RPGs today, in my opinion, have gotten so convoluted with their different, I don't know what you would want to call it, sort of additions to the battle systems, such that you've got to go out and collect and all these different items and, you know, do the alchemy thing. I'm thinking here of like the Ate series or Mugen Souls, where there's just like system upon system upon system that you have to learn and I really think waste time with. Whereas back in the day, the role-playing games, you know, they had interesting battle mechanics, they had interesting systems and different synergies that you could have with, I mean, go back to Final Fantasy VII, where you can, I guess, enchant your weapons with the magicka and stuff like that. But it was simple. It didn't pull you away from the sense of journey that you got, from the character development, from just the overall fun of the game. You didn't need to labor and grind. I mean, you had to grind, certainly, for levels, but you didn't have to worry about, like I said, sort of doing the hunter-gatherer alchemy stuff. To me, it's a waste of time. And I would even say, artistically, the art style back then was focused. It was always engaging. It was bold. Whereas today, I think the RPGs, a lot of them have kind of veered in this direction of what I call, for lack of a better term, the cutesy anime, girl anime style, where they all look like these badly done, digitally drawn, or CG anime characters. And they feel kind of cut and paste today, where I really got the sense back in the 90s that, I mean, go back to the Squaresoft, the great Squaresoft RPGs, that they really felt like true works of passion. So those genres are worse, and now we get to the contested genres. And I think the arguments can go both ways, and they're very compelling in both ways, so I don't know that we can say better or worse here. But sports games today, there are some really excellent sports games, and I'll talk about one in this episode that I've been playing pretty consistently over the past couple of weeks. Sports games, I would say, over the past 5 years, they've had their ups and downs, but they are compelling. And I criticize EA for their lack of effort. They've monopolized a lot of these licenses. But if I compare Madden of today to, say, Madden on the PS1, the Madden games of today are better. Certainly, games like FIFA have come a long way. The wrestling games, I don't know if you can say that they're better, but by and large, even sort of titles that are off the beaten path, like Virtua Tennis 4, a game that I think is chronically underrated, very, very good game. I think it came out in 2011, 2012, something like that. But at the same time, you have great retro sports games like Blades of Steel. Now, Blades of Steel to this day remains incredibly fun. I love Blades of Steel. It's exciting. It always feels as fresh as it did back in whenever that came out, 89, 90. And yet, games like NHL 2016 are very good games, and I can have a wonderfully fun, competitive game in NHL 16 with my friend who's a big sports game player, and then we can go into the game room, fire up Blades of Steel, and have equally as much fun. Tecmo Bowl, another great example. Tecmo Bowl, still as engaging and playable today as it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and yet Madden has improved, actually, since the PlayStation 3 era. Boxing games, the Fight Night, the RPG Fight Night Championship or Champion, one of the most underrated boxing games. Terrific stuff. So, baseball. I loved the RBI baseball series. Spent hours and hours playing that on the Genesis, RBI 93, the classic game with the grass on the box. I love that. And yet, MLB The Show has taken baseball to an exciting new place. So I don't know that you can say one is better than the other. I think we're well served with great retro sports games and also great modern sports games. Third-person action games, and I'm going to include third-person platformers in this discussion, obviously, with things like the Batman Arkham series, with Sleeping Dogs. I know people like Gods of War. I've never particularly got into that series. Not Gears of War. I have actually played Gears of War, and that was in itself very, very good when it came out. I'm thinking of the Greek god Kratos game God of War, not Gears of War, God of War. That I never got into, but again, a lot of people like that third-person action, and even, I'm going to say Red Faction Guerrilla, which was a terrific third-person action game that, again, I think gets very, very little attention, but really, really good. Games like that, and obviously Grand Theft Auto 5 in particular, they're highly polished, great combat systems, huge open worlds, and yet, if we go back to third-person action platformers, just the third-person 3D experience, and you go back to Mario 64, still a brilliant game. Banjo-Kazooie, which I really, really loved, or Zelda Ocarina of Time. Those early third-person 3D games are excellent, excellent games. And I don't think you can say one is better than the other. They offer us a different kind of engaging take on third-person action. But just because Grand Theft Auto 5 has this amazing representation of modern-day Los Angeles and has seemingly endless amounts of stuff to do in it, I can still turn on Mario 64 and have as good a time today as I did in 1996. So Klonoa might be another one, although Klonoa was more of a 2.5D type game. But I think a lot of third-person action games from the mid to late 90s into the 2000s. I mean, Shenmue, an example of a game that is iconic, and I'm going to admit that I have had a hard time getting into Shenmue, but it was more about its pacing and less about its third-person traversal and fighting. Nonetheless, I don't think there's a really clear winner there. I think you'd be happy, again, with both examples. Shoot-'em-ups are interesting because it's a genre that hasn't really evolved graphically, and I would argue that it hasn't necessarily evolved technically. I always saw that there was a big jump in shmups, say from the late 80s, early 90s to the late 90s, where you can have so many bullets on screen in different patterns. But of course, if you're playing things like Espeleta 2, Mushe Hime Sama Futari, graphically they honestly look like Genesis games, but just with more bullets. And of course, I guess they have online leaderboards and stuff like that. So I think in that case, you don't have a lot of evolution, and again, I might be missing some things, but even when I buy the newer stuff on Steam, and some of them very good games like Crimson Clover, they're not pushing the envelope in any significant way from what they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Take a game like Gunbird, which I always enjoyed. Gunbird 2, Mars Matrix, and they more or less look and play the same as some of the later releases on the Xbox 360 from Cave, which is a good thing. This is it's just been a very consistent genre, and it has a formula that I don't think fans of the genre would want to see change. So it's contested insofar as it's remained the same for about, I would say, pushing 18 to 20 years, and yet, if we go back to, say, the early Capcom, 1940, 41 games, which were also very good, or Raiden 1, I think then you would say, well, yeah, the games today are much better than that, but yet, if you compared Dodonpachi, or Donpachi, whatever the original Donpachi was on the Japanese Saturn, and you compare that to Raiden 1, you would say the same thing. Oh, well, Donpachi is a better game. Other examples of things that haven't changed that much, I guess you would say puzzle games kind of fit into that category. I'm unaware of puzzle games doing anything that new or interesting. I guess in the PlayStation 2 era, you had Puzzle Quest, was it? Where it was trying to mix in a role-playing game with the sort of match 3 puzzle game. And that was kind of a fad for a bit, but even Candy Crush, stuff like that. I think puzzle games, by and large, have remained fairly consistent. Maybe Luminous, or Lumens, or whatever it's called, being an example of something new. I know there have been other sort of music rhythm puzzle games that have been fairly new, but even I think there was like Pokemon Battle, or on the 3DS, forget what it's called. I think I actually reviewed that. But anyway, or Pokemon Battle Troze, something like that. They're all more or less doing the same things. I just picked up the Tetris Puyo Puyo game on the Vita, and it's a lot of fun, but it's, aside from a nice updated coat of paint, fundamentally the same games. And again, I would say that the puzzle genre, probably to its fans, doesn't really need to evolve beyond what it is now and what it has been for the last 10, 15 years or so. So I think this is me sort of coming around and saying, you know what, I think there are a lot of broadly positive innovations when you look at how these different genres have evolved, although I will stand by my overall criticism of the business practices of the industry and the kind of laziness that frequently goes into producing the biggest AAA titles. And again, also some of the indie titles, which are just sort of piggybacking off of each other. Still, I do think that because of the evolution of racing games, fighting, RTS, and FPS games, you can't categorically say that modern gaming is completely inferior to what we had in the retro era. There are some bright spots, and hopefully 10 years from now we can say, hey, this is the trend has continued. Maybe someone will do something different with shmups. Maybe there will be a continual evolution. Anyway, at least that's what I'm hoping for. So obviously you've heard my rant this month, and I want to kind of step back and talk about another problem with online interactions and kind of the lack of substance that you get on social media. And, you know, I had posted last month's episode, I talked about art and gaming, and then what I've been doing is taking one or two segments from each podcast and just uploading them as kind of independent videos on YouTube. So I posted the art thing, and I got some negative criticism, which is fine. I mean, it's a controversial argument, and again, I think if anyone took the time to actually, and I'm not saying anyone of of you guys, the listeners, but certainly the powers that be in games journalism really tried to come to terms with a lot of things that I said in that piece and actually in that essay, it would create a lot of discussion and I would get a lot of criticism, and I was readily prepared for that. So I'm not really directing this little segment at the people who criticized that video, but it's just a number of interactions that I've had on YouTube. and other forms of social media have had this quality where you present an argument. You present an argument that is well-reasoned, or in some cases, and I've posted things that are emotional and stuff like that, but you present something, you present a review, you present an opinion, and then someone comes up to you and says, well, it's just your opinion. It's just your opinion, man. It's relative. Everything's relative. You can't you can't take what people are saying seriously, because in the end, why even pay attention to it? It's just subjective. And you'll encounter this in life as well, at least I have, where you're making a strong point. You're presenting some factual evidence. You're presenting some data that supports your argument, and yet people simply write it off. Not really engaging with it and writing it off, but they're just saying, well, I don't need to listen to it because it's just an opinion. And I find outside of work, where in some cases, and it's not even in work, but outside of work, there's very little tolerance for a complex or controversial idea. We're quite willing to say, in the case of art, or in the case of some other videos that I've posted, well, you're just saying that, it's just your opinion. If someone creates something and they think it's art, it's art. Stop talking about it. And I think this is where a lot of the debates kind of go south on YouTube. Where the overall level of sophistication tends to drop is that we're very quick to write people off. Perhaps we lack the attention to really listen to what they have to say or read their long post. But we're very just quick to say, well, nothing really matters. The content of your ideas, the logic of what you're saying really doesn't matter because you're just offering an opinion. So I think this is a cultural illness. I'm not saying, well, everyone needs to listen to my video on art and stuff like that, or read the Retro Game Bulletin. No, this is a broader issue. It goes well beyond that. I think we're getting in to a period of overwhelming relativism in games journalism, but also in society in general. So we're not willing to take a stand on anything. I mean, you can see this in the writing of Kotaku, for example. And I liked Kotaku in the early days, but now it's all clickbaity, it's all very impressionistic. Even the titles, so that new comic book looks good, and people are just doing these stream of consciousness posts, which in many instances become a kind of sales copy. No one wants to take the time to say anything substantive, and then in the comments, again, I'm thinking of Kotaku here, some people do, and again, you get this attack. Well, fuck you, man. It's just your opinion. I think that's a dangerous road to go down. Relativism is kind of interesting. It's a form of skepticism. It's a form of saying it's radical skepticism that nothing has any meaning. Nothing has any inherent intellectual quality to it. What you're saying is just as good as what everyone else is saying. It doesn't matter. We don't even have to look at it because it's all your opinion. So it's better just to be kind of stuck here within the boundaries of my own opinion and my own bias and not listen to what anyone else has to say. Now, I've always been against that type of thing simply because it's not fun. I mean, what's the point of having social media and interacting with all sorts of people if you're not actually paying attention to the substance of what they're saying? I have a lot of commenters on my channel who write paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff, and sometimes they agree with me, sometimes they disagree with me, but it's always fascinating to read. And check out some of my videos, and you'll see what I'm talking about. My experience on YouTube would have been a lot less entertaining if I didn't get that kind of feedback, and I respond and write back to every single one of them. So why would you not want that? So we have this relativism, which is, again, a kind of radical skepticism. And strangely, what it becomes when you're bludgeoned with it online is it becomes dogmatic. I mean, think about it in this way. If I'm telling you nothing matters, and if I'm telling you I don't care about your opinion, you're just one person, doesn't matter what you're saying, I have my own opinion, it's equally valid. If you just keep on hammering that point home, you become a dogmatist because you are insisting to people time and time again that they shouldn't even speak. And that's I think maybe the root of why I got as angry as I did in that giant bomb interaction is because, okay, what I said was mean, I guess, on the one hand, but this idea that only certain people have a voice that's worth listening to. And my opinion on Giant Bomb didn't matter because, well, I don't have all these subscribers. What could I possibly have to offer? When skepticism or relativism becomes dogmatism, you have stagnation because no one wants to say anything. And at a certain point, no one will venture an opinion, no one will read an opinion, no one will be capable of dissenting thought. And dissenting thought is wonderfully entertaining, whether you believe it or not. So let's take a gaming example of this. Let's say I came out and said to you guys, Mega Man is the worst platforming game in the history of games. That's my opinion. If you say to me, well, it doesn't matter, that's your opinion, one opinion's as good as the next, you're ignoring the fact that what I've said is extraordinarily controversial and, in fact, wrong. So let's say I went one step further and said, Keith Courage is actually a better platforming game than Mega Man, the entire Mega Man series on the NES. That's wrong. There are objective factors that you can point out that will tell me that I'm wrong. And any one of them, okay, sales figures, control, sort of cultural reception, historical significance within gaming, that is a bad opinion. And it's substantial, it is actually objectively of less value than if I were to say, well, Mario Brothers is the greatest platforming game of all time. And you might believe Mega Man is. We can go back and forth on that, and that back and forth is interesting by virtue of the conviction that we have in those ideas. And similarly, if I was just flying the flag of Keith Courage, you should attack me, not, well, hey, what you're saying is stupid, we're not listening to you because you're a nobody. What you should do is actually write to me and give me all the counterfactual evidence that suggests that I'm wrong. Keith Courage was a bad game. Well, it's an okay game. That's a story for a different time. But that whole disproving my sort of blanket statement that Mega Man is one of the worst platformers of all time, disproving that is interesting. But if we get into this mode where everything is relative, what's the point of even talking to each other? That's a huge problem, and that has to stop in games journalism, in social media, and in the retro gaming community. All right, time for a hardware update. You know, it's funny, a little bit earlier in the show I was using the launch of the GTX 1080 and 1070 as an example of how to get a launch right, or one example. The fact that it was announced on May 17th and available for purchase within 1 month's time. Well, we're not quite at June 17th, But we're about 10 days away now, and this launch has been a debacle. And I'm not sure if it's by design or not, but it has not been as seamless as I was hoping. So there's a dark side to this launch, but there's also a big upside, and I just want to talk about that here in the hardware update. The dark side, of course, is that NVIDIA released the GTX 1080 Founders Edition, and they priced it, it was a reference card, priced it about $100 higher than their competition. At least the base models, anyway, was the sort of vapor chamber cooling solution, and released it early so that if you wanted one, you had to pony up that money for the NVIDIA card. And I was about to do it, honestly, because I just finished building my computer, and as I've said, the graphics card was the last piece that I needed, and it came with kind of a free upgrade to a GTX 970, which is fine. But obviously when you build a new computer, you want the latest graphics technology. And I knew NVIDIA had something around the corner when I was building this in March. So I figured, okay, fine, I'm just gonna wait for the launch. So I was about to do it, but as soon as those cards were in stock, those Founders Edition reference cards, they were sold out completely. And I was at work. I couldn't get to the computer to order one. So I figured, I read more about it, and okay, the partner cards, the custom PCB cards are coming out from companies like EVGA and Asus and things like that. So I said, okay, hey, not a big deal. I'll wait a little bit, and I'll order one of those cards. Well, we're now in the process of those cards hitting the market after Computex 2016, and it's kind of a farce, because what we're seeing is that they have a whole range of options, different coolers, and I think these are the cards that you want. But it seems like as soon as one of them comes in stock, and there've only been a couple that you've even been able to pre-order, as soon as something goes up to pre-order, it's shut down almost instantly. And the only things that are coming back into stock are the Founders Edition card. So if you still really want one, looks like everything else, partner AIB cards, are being delayed. You have to get the Founders Edition. So I think it's a little bit of market manipulation on the part of NVIDIA, and I've been following the NVIDIA subreddit, Twitter, a couple of people that I follow on Twitter, just looking at the news, and it seems like, it's NVIDIA controlling the release of these chips, really trying to force you into paying for a more expensive card with less performance, even though the performance difference between the custom and the reference cards is probably for most users negligible. Now, I'm not saying that, I know there are people out there who try to do the insane overclocks, and yes, the custom PCBs will allow you to get a better overclock off of these cards, and for less money and more performance, why wouldn't you want one? But I don't think if you have the reference cooler, you're going to be completely left out. So I've discovered through this process a website called nowinstock.net, and I've known stuff like this exists where you can kind of see like what's in stock the moment it comes in stock, and so I've been tracking this at work. I've had some time, and I wound up pre-ordering a partner card, the EVGA kind of mid-range. It's the, I forget, it has their AX cooler or ACX cooler. It's a super clocked. It's not the For the Win or classified. And that was about $650. And it's only $20 more for the current top of the line, which is the For the Win, but they had very similar specs. So I did this kind of cynically. It's just like, well, let me pre-order this one, and if I can get a better one, because I was kind of hoping for the Asus or the MSI or the Galax version, then I was going to pick that up as I look earlier in the week and just cancel, or later in the week and just cancel the pre-order. But again, I'm getting all these updates. Oh, the $700 ones are coming into stock, but not the better, cheaper ones, and it's a huge problem. Now, as far as the one I ordered, I like EVGA. I think they have great customer service, great return policy, and again, as far as the partner cards go, yes, you're going to get a better cooling solution, but the performance from one to the other will be fairly similar, and again, not all that dissimilar to the reference one. The one that I have on pre-order and that I have definitely reserved is seemingly the standard reference PCB with just the EVGA cooler, which I have on the 970. It's actually a very, very nice cooler. Temps are fine. It actually shuts the blowers down if you're not really using the card, so very, very quiet. I don't have a problem with it, but I would kind of prefer another one, so I don't know. And some people say, oh, just wait. But the estimates we're hearing are that you may not be able to get these things until mid-July. And I'm impatient only because I built this computer, and with the anticipation of having a new top-of-the-line card, and maybe all card launches are like this. I've never been in the situation where I was purchasing a new graphics card this close to launch, but it always seemed like when I needed a NVIDIA product, didn't matter if I was buying whatever the top of the line was or something mid-range, always available, and I've never had a problem until now. But it's a time horizon thing. I typically get the end of June up till the 4th of July, typically get some vacation time, and I actually usually have that time to myself. Girlfriend tends to be doing other things, so it's actually a great gaming time. And so when that time comes up, it's one of the only periods of the year where I can really say, hey, I've got 2 weeks where I can devote myself to playing some games, and I would love to play some computer games, get ready for the Steam sale, and really enjoy this new build. I mean, not to say that I haven't, but when you're working, you don't have the time necessarily to devote hours to it. So it's kind of a bummer if you really do have to wait until mid-July on some of these cards. Now, I am running, as I've said before, a 2560 by 1080 ultra wide LG, and it's a really good monitor for what it is, but it's not obviously a necessity to get a GTX 1080 to push it. Some people would say that it's insane overkill. That having been said, there are some games that I can't max out, like Project Cars. Still can't max that out, even at this resolution. So hopefully this situation will resolve itself, stock will come in. That's the dark side of this. The upside, however, the positive story that has come out of Computex and with regard to these cards, they launched the 1070. I have no idea what stock is going to be on that. That's coming out in a couple days. I believe it's June 10th. And the 1080 really represents, I think, an overall lowering of the price of entry of really good PC gaming, assuming you're already using a PC. Why is that? Well, I think if we were still in the old console landscape where we knew, hey, buy a PS3, it's going to last you 5 years, or PS4 rather, Xbox One, it's going to last you 5 years. But now that we're getting into this constant hardware refresh from Microsoft and Sony, and I've talked about this on other episodes, I think we're looking at, unless they have some sort of quick upgrade program where you get $100 off if you trade your old system in, which I don't know that's going to happen. We're in this model now where console gaming has become way more expensive if you want the best experience. Not to mention you're paying for Xbox Live and whatever it is, PSN. What the 1070 is going to do, the early benchmarks say that it does indeed beat a Titan, or a Titan X, or whatever the latest Titan graphics card is, and those are over $1,000 a pop. They're releasing it, I think, at $370, around the $370 price point, and these cards are so power efficient that you're getting all this performance. You don't actually have to upgrade anything else in your PC. In fact, it'll be obviously less of a power draw than probably what you have in there now if you have a graphics card. So in the past, if you wanted a really beefy card, it meant, in some cases, upgrading the power supply, and obviously it drew more electricity. Although, to be fair, some of these non-reference cards do have extra 8-pin connections, so they are going to draw more power, but that's largely for overclocking headroom. It doesn't need that power to run. It runs on 180 watts. And so that's a lot of performance for under $400. So if you already have a PC, would you rather spend $370 on this card that will give you great results in PC gaming, or spend $400 on the PlayStation Neo? I think the card obviously becomes more compelling in that situation. Then it came out that the cards are so power efficient and their thermal properties are such that they are going to go right in to laptops. There's going to be no mobile version. These chips, the 1080 and the 1070, will be built into gaming laptops, which is amazing. I mean, I think that's absolutely a tremendous revelation, because the argument that you would sometimes get from gamers unsure of getting into the PC gaming world was, well, I don't really use a desktop anymore, I like a tablet, or I need a laptop for work, and gaming on a laptop sucks, so now you're saying I'm going to have to buy a gaming PC, and I still need a laptop, or all of this. Now that argument's out the window, because for the first time you're going to get the desktop experience in the laptop. Obviously, they're going to tweak it to make it even more efficient, so you may not quite get the same performance that you might have in slapping a 1070 into a desktop computer, but it's going to be a lot better than the mobile chips. The mobile chips have gotten better. I bought a gaming laptop a couple of years ago now. It had a 870M in it, and that thing was very capable. I was surprised, but now we're entering a situation where, and who knows what the price point is going to be, but let's say you can grab a Windows laptop with a 1070 for $1,300. And, it has the SSD and RAM and all that. Again, that's a really great proposition. It's a little bit on the high side for a laptop. But then again, if you're, look at what people pay for the gaming, but the MacBook, higher-end MacBooks, still a pretty good deal, and it may even be cheaper than that. So I think the cost of entry in PC gaming is coming down, and of course, since these cards are quite capable of VR, it's going to make VR cheaper for a lot of people. And actually, I read an article, I can't remember where, that said not only are these cards great for VR, they were put in laptops, but actually the price of the 970 is plummeting. It was always over $300. Apparently now it can be had for like $280 or something like that, which is the recommended minimum spec for VR by Oculus and Vive. So those cards, if you wanted to get into VR and you don't want to pay the money for the 1080 or 1070, grab a used 970 and dabble in VR that way. So I think this overall will be a great, potentially a great opportunity for a lot of gamers to get into PC gaming at a relatively reasonable price. Not to mention that AMD was forced to come out. They released a $200 VR-ready card. I think it was the 480X or something like that. They say 2 of them are faster than a 1080 in certain games, so for about $400. Of course, they're hybrid, water-cooled cards. I don't know if they're going to be the solution for everyone, but yeah, let's hope that this is the beginning of an era where the cost of PC gaming plummets and we all benefit.
You are approaching Saturn. You are only seconds away. I have arranged for you to meet my companion. He will lead you. Watch and listen. Please, don't disappoint him. He doesn't like that.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aw, hit it! Sega's next-generation gaming platform. Revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay. All with amazing new 3D experiences never before possible on home game systems. Wow.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
So with E3 around the corner, I thought it'd be cool to take a look at the history of E3, and I was reading up on a number of the events. Actually, I was surprised to find out that the first one did not occur in the early 90s. Somehow I thought the first one was in the early 90s, actually 95. And just kind of look at the history of this event and what I remember from following it, not just online, but of course also in the magazines. And I came up with a personal list of the top 5 E3s of all time. And I just thought it'd be fun. Obviously, we'll all have different memories and things that appeal to us. But I really think that the 3 that I chose certainly have played a role in video game history and certainly had a personal meaning for me. So the first one would have to be E3 2001. And E3 2001 had a lot of interesting announcements. Of course, you had the GameCube and the Xbox featured, and they were released, I think, later in 2001 at some point, which this is a big deal. I don't think people remember. I mean, Microsoft is just such a kind of an assumed player in the video game industry, but back then, the idea that Microsoft was getting in to console gaming was very exciting. And we didn't really know what the system would be like. I mean, I think they demoed, I'm just looking at the list here, yeah, so they demoed games like Project Gotham Racing was a really big one, Dead or Alive 3, and of course Halo, and of course other things, but those were the ones that stood out to me. And what was so surprising was that these games seemed fundamentally different than other console games. It had the feeling like the PC was finally making its way into our living rooms, and that was a perception that I think held. I keep on saying, I have a friend who got the system first, and there was a guy in high school who got every system at launch, and he got Project Gotham Racing and Halo, and it was pretty incredible. So when they announced that, I felt back then that there was a change going on in the industry, that it was maturing, and I think it did to an extent. I think we got an experience that previously you could only get on a high-end PC, or at least it felt that way. Now, the GameCube was something interesting. I think by and large, a number of us, and by us I mean my friends at the time, felt kind of let down by the N64. Ultimately, the hype around that was so huge, and it didn't deliver in the way we wanted, particularly with a lack of role-playing games and kind of a lack of fighting games as well. So when they announced the GameCube, I think the first reaction was excited that they finally moved away from cartridge-based media, and the games actually that they announced and that formed the launch lineup were pretty impressive. Luigi's Mansion, certainly, and I don't know if they did Sunshine at the event, but Mario Sunshine looked amazing. Wave Race Blue Storm actually looked pretty amazing, and Wave Race is kind of forgotten now, but that was a very, very strong tech demo. And I don't know if they talked about this at E3 of that year, but certainly the Star Wars game that launched was really impressive, and actually is still impressive to this day. I don't know that they didn't unveil the Game Boy Advance at this particular event, and I remember kind of saying, yeah, what's with this new system? But yeah, I don't know exactly what they had there, but I think they had announced it a little bit earlier. And of course, this was the final E3 for the Dreamcast, and they just kind of, I think, announced like Sonic Adventure 2 and some other stuff. So again, a turning point for the games industry, and I think nicely on display in that one. That was number 5. Number 4 was E3 2013. And as E3 has evolved, it's actually become less significant. And I thought, for all the hype about last year and all the big announcements that we had last year for kind of retro-inspired games, I think E3 2013 will kind of go down as the last major E3. And why? Well, of course, you had the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One sort of coming into being, and you had the return of a little console war. If you remember, Microsoft had their utterly disastrous, one of the worst product launches ever when they announced the Xbox One, and they were talking about TV and how it was going to revolutionize your cable TV subscription, and you could watch all these different sports on it. And they actually, the funny video floating around YouTube of like a spliced up version of that event, and like they just like sports TV, and very, very funny. How, I don't know who did it, but if you type in like Xbox One 2013 or something like that, you'll find it. And so PlayStation comes out and they hit the lower price point. They release that video. How are you going to share games? Because, of course, the Xbox One had that sort of onerous system where you had to add friends, and then there was kind of a paywall attached to it. And they said, oh, this is how you share games on the PlayStation 4. And someone handed a game to someone else, a couple of the Sony executives. So that felt like a big, significant battle. And I'm going to admit, once that was over, I pre-ordered the PlayStation 4 the next day, and the kind of euphoria that we were going to have a console war. And of course, terrible mistake. PlayStation 4 has proven to be a huge disappointment, and actually it's the Xbox One that's the more interesting console at this point, as I've said many times. But it felt special. It felt like there was a rivalry again at E3. So once E3 gets canceled, and I do see that happening in 5 years, at some point the developers and the console makers aren't going to pay money to kind of advertise in this way, when, of course, the internet and YouTube does all of that for them. And I think looking back, 2013 will be seen as the last big one. Number 3 on the list for me will be E3 1999, quite simply because it was the launch of the Dreamcast, the beginning of the 6th generation era of consoles. And I believe Nintendo also mentioned and gave some of the tech specs of the GameCube, but this was, to me, all about the Sega Dreamcast. And it felt, I have to admit it really felt new and exciting and innovative and really different from the previous generation consoles. Obviously, the Sega Saturn was a huge letdown, and there was a lack of faith in Sega, and I think the opinion that I had and that a lot of my friends had was that we're never going to buy another Sega system again. We were burnt by Sega with the 32X and the Saturn. But just the way it was marketed, the fact that it was white, it's a silly thing, but it just looked totally different than the other Sega consoles. The online connectivity, the great-looking sports games that had a reasonable price of $199, and the controller with the VMU, all of this kind of shook us out of our complacency around Sega. Did I buy it? No, didn't really have the money. It came out on 9/9/99, and of course that was that was a great thing. I've been talking about this the whole episode. They announce it in June, and it's out in September. That's what E3 should be. You announce some great new piece of tech, you announce some great game, you give the people a couple months to get really hyped about it, and you launch it in the fall. Absolutely terrific. And I don't know what games that they demoed at this one, but yeah, I didn't find a list. I'm trying to remember. Maybe it was Ready to Rumble. Seems like that was a major game that launched with it. Of course, the Sega 2K football series, which, again, sports games kind of get a bad rap, but that was an absolutely incredible looking game, and it really seemed like a huge step forward, especially if you played Madden 99 and 2000 on the PlayStation 1. So major E3, and I just remember saying to myself, oh gosh, I wish I was not a high school kid on 9/9/99 so I could pick that up. And I want to say that there's something else released, maybe the Neo Geo Pocket, which I guess is not a big deal, but nonetheless, a kind of cool system in and of itself. And again, Nintendo and I think Sony did kind of tech demos or release the tech specs for the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. Number 2 for me will be E3 1996. E3 96 was a pretty interesting show because we had I don't want to say the launch, but I think the North American unveiling, if you want to call it that, of the Nintendo 64. We saw Mario 64, and that E3 really had a major effect on a lot of people that I knew. And I was, at that point, kind of leaning more towards PlayStation. And again, I've always found myself in this period of time in high school kind of not really out of the loop, but it all seemed impossible that I would ever get this new technology that was coming out. It was funny because I've talked about my whole gaming in the 16-bit era and sort of crazy rules that my parents had, and so I couldn't get the SNES, but I get this system, that system, everything like that. So, but anyway, at that point, they were still buying things for me. Then I found that as I got older, I got into this middle ground of like early to mid high school where I was too young to really get a serious job because I didn't drive, but also, in my parents' estimation, too old to be given gifts. So it seemed like the N64 was just a pipe dream for me. And I had to wait around a year and a half to get it. Nonetheless, I had a friend who, I don't know if you could pre-order right after E3, but I somehow remember that he saw E3, he saw Mario 64, and then he saw that game Quest 64, and I'm not really seeing anything that I'm looking at that Quest 64 was part of this presentation at E3, although I kind of remember screenshots popping up in the magazines. But anyway, he was convinced that this was the system of the future and that these two games would be the most amazing games ever released. And he actually thought Quest 64 would be a lot better than Mario 64. So he pre-ordered, I think, if you could pre-order, and he got it day one. And this isn't the guy that had everything. This is a guy that really had to work to get this, and he had saved up this money for a long, long time. And then incidentally, he got it home, and he's like, oh, Quest 64, not that great. But, of course, Mario 64 was terrific. So that, and I think people forget, certainly if you're, I don't know, between 28 and 38, you're going to remember that the N64, just the hype around it for that Christmas was incredible. So, and it all started at this E3. So it's really great E3. I believe that Square showed off Final Fantasy VII. At least I'm seeing some stuff to that effect. There was the price cutting between the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. I think they both went down to $199. And yeah, it was the E3 where you finally had the clear picture of what the fifth console generation was going to look like, because the Nintendo system was always looming. You had the Sega Saturn, you had the PlayStation, but I think a lot of people were really who didn't have a ton of disposable income waiting to see what Nintendo was going to unveil, and it was incredibly satisfying when they had this presentation at E3. And then, of course, number one, I have to say my favorite E3 of all time is the first E3, 1995. And how could we ever forget Sega with their surprise launch? And it was really the moment that destroyed Sega. Obviously, it took a number of years, but the supply chain turned against them. I think the fans didn't turn against them, but when you got the system and you got like the buggy Virtua Fighter, it kind of seemed like a desperate move. And I even remember I had a major friend who was a major Sega fan, and he was on board, and I just remember saying, as much as I enjoyed the Genesis, I'm going to hold off on this. I don't trust Sega enough to give them my money this early, and I wanted to see what other hardware manufacturers had in store. Obviously, the PlayStation was presented here as well, and of course, this is the famous, it's $299, the short speech, and that, oh my god, that was just a huge controversy, and Sega looked so bad coming out of E3 95. Now, if you go onto YouTube, there's a particularly fascinating, I don't know if you want to call it a documentary, but it's basically a kind of amateur video of people going around, and it's mostly focused on the Jaguar. But it's just you get the sense of how massive this was. Don't forget, this is a time where you had the magazines, you didn't have the internet, and the idea that there was a show where you could actually see what was coming over the next 6 to 12 months was terrific. And of course, the coverage was pretty good in the magazines, at least for the time. And the hype was something, a lot of people bring this up. Johnny Millennium talks about this, how you really had to use your imagination. You got a taste of all of these things, but you just had to use your fantasy and imagine what these games would be like. And of course, a lot of the times, your fantasies were sometimes better than the products, but other times they exceeded what you could conceive of. A couple other launches, obviously not as major as the Sony-Sega battle, but this was the launch of the Virtual Boy. And I do remember reading about the Virtual Boy in the magazines and thinking, oh man, it looks so cool. I think SNK also announced the Neo Geo CD, which obviously was also kind of a commercial failure in this country. And then I just mentioned the Jaguar being shown off. I want to say that they had this in this documentary video that you can find. I'm forgetting what it's called. I think it was like Jaguar Light Machine or something, or Light System. It was basically an early attempt at VR, and you could see that in those videos. I'm seeing, as far as the stats go, 50,000 people attended. This was at a time when E3 was opened up to, I believe it was just open to the public, or at least it wasn't as hard to get an invite. So how can you possibly put anything above E3 1995, where one of the great video game companies of all time has such a horrendous blunder that it costs them their access to the hardware market? It's a historic moment in gaming, and it happened at E3 1995. I think you have to put that as the most memorable and significant E3 of all time. About 8 years since I've been consciously in the retro gaming community. Now, obviously, I've been playing retro games for my whole life, even when they were new, but I think the retro gaming community, it's fair to say, came about 2007, 2008, where you started seeing the first YouTubers coming out with their retro gaming channels. And while I didn't really discover YouTube in 2008, or at least the retro gaming community in YouTube in 2008, it was around that time where I really started to heavily look on eBay and pick up old systems and games that I had been wanting to play for some time, and sort of slowly but surely began to really add to my collection. Now, I had saved a majority of my old games from when I was a kid, and I still had them in pretty good condition, but I just wanted to really collect all the things that I couldn't buy back then, and I started building the collection. Then by about 2009, 2010, I discovered all of the sort of major retro gaming YouTubers and became, I would say, firmly entrenched in the retro gaming community. And it's 2016, and I wanted to kind of look back and answer the question, what is retro? What is this community in which we are all active? And this is a project that I did last year and put out a series of kind of quick videos answering the question, what is retro? But much like the art discussion that I presented in the last episode of this podcast, these videos kind of got lost in the shuffle, didn't get a lot of attention, but I think the argument in them was kind of interesting, and it's something that I think we as retro gamers as a community, now that we're all getting a little bit older, we've been in this thing for a while, I think it's fair and needed to kind of ask yourself, well, what does it mean to be a retro gamer? So in those 4 videos, I kind of identified 4 aspects of retro gaming, 4 elements that kind of create the community that we have. And the first one was physical space and physical interaction as being kind of the groundwork of the hobby. And it was something that I think is lost to a lot of younger kids today who are getting into retro gaming. But I think the passion that a lot of us have for video games really stems from the fact that gaming was a novelty when people who were in their 30s and 40s were kids. There was a kind of physical infrastructure that you had to navigate to play games. And of course, one of those places was the arcade. You had to go to the arcades. It was something special. You couldn't just pick up a video game and play it. Even within the house, maybe there was only one TV, and you could only get to that TV once a week. So there was this sense of almost like a pilgrimage that you had to make to play your game. So there was something special. There was something about that time that you had with a game, whether it was in an arcade or at a friend's house or for an hour or two in your home when your parents weren't using the television, that I think for a lot of us made gaming stand out. And I think that's important. It was such a break from everyday reality and everyday entertainment I think the television was always on for a lot of us. You could always go to the movies, but gaming just kind of stood apart from these, what seemed to me anyway, kind of mundane entertainment options, and it felt special. It felt very meaningful to actually get your hands on a video game. And for me, even when I finally got my NES, I've mentioned this in a number of other places, it was on this TV cart, and so I had to roll it into my room, and sometimes I couldn't get the upstairs TV. My parents had it. So it's the sense of pilgrimage, physical space, physical interaction that set gaming apart, and I think that really laid the groundwork for us. And then the origins of collecting. I kind of asked myself, where did this urge to collect begin? And for me, I think it had a lot to do with early video game magazines and early advertisements, because they presented this prospect of amassing a library of content. You know, think back to the back of a Sega Genesis box or the back of an SNES box, and you saw all the games that you could possibly get. And I think for a lot of kids, you weren't going to get all of them, certainly. You may only have had the opportunity to get one or two, but the dream was planted. And you know, as far as the magazines go, the magazines chronicled so much of the hobby that was inaccessible and even beyond what you saw on the back of the box. And the magazines seemed to be in this enviable position insofar as they got to play all of these things that you would never play, and that they offered a kind of perspective on the hobby that made them irresistible. And I always looked at those magazines, and I think friends did too, although they didn't necessarily articulate it. But as you looked at the retro, well, they weren't retro at the time, as you looked at the video game magazines, they kind of planted this seed about this far-off future where you weren't going to have to go out to Toys R Us and get the ticket and get the game and only have that happen 6 times a year, that you could actually play all of these games and have this almost objective or synthetic perspective on gaming where, yeah, I'll have played all of the fighting games and I can really say which one is best. But I think if you look back at those magazines, the negative aspect is that the coverage of so many of these games was more or less superficial. You had a couple screenshots, you had oftentimes a poorly written block of what was essentially advertising copy, so you didn't want to leave the last word on these games to magazines. And I think when eBay came about, when YouTube came about, and you could, for a reasonable price, actually live the dream and pick up all of these games and actually comment on them and discuss them with fellow fans, that was the logical extension of the dreaming that you did as a kid when you had the video game magazine in front of you. So I see that really as the origin. And again, maybe it's going to be different for other people, but at least within my circle of friends, I think the collecting passion for gaming really began as we were flipping through EGM, and you saw all of these games in one place and dream that you could one day get to play them all in your own home for a reasonable price. So let me get to the concept of nostalgia. Now, nostalgia is an absolute driving factor in this hobby of ours, in this pursuit of ours, but I think the type of nostalgia that we engage in the retro gaming community is quite different than the traditional understanding of the term. And, you know, there are a number of definitions for nostalgia that circulate, academic and otherwise, but I think the common theme is that nostalgia, you know, traditional nostalgia represents a type of yearning for an often idyllic past that can never be captured or duplicated in the present. Some people say it's a mourning over the kind of temporal ruptures that separate our childhood from the present time. But gaming nostalgia, and likely other forms of nostalgia now in 2016 and beyond, doesn't really follow this model. Because while retro gamers do, on the one hand, yearn to return to their youth, I think technology changes how we experience this nostalgia. So, what do I mean by that? I think there are kind of two elements. There's a kind of a personal answer and a cultural answer, and so we go back to thinking about our youth, and yeah, I think this was a more positive time, or at least it was a time when the future looked very positive. We had these, as I mentioned in my piece on art, pleasurable human-machine interactions, and there wasn't any kind of looming threat in the distance. This was not a time when our lives were being captured and laid bare by big data, or when companies were going to use our purchase history or our interactions within a game to track our movements and create dossiers of clicks that supposedly represent our interests. I think growing up, there was this hopeful feeling around technological development that we've kind of lost today. It may have been naive, but these were times, you think about when you were playing a game, it was a time without paywalls or DLC or restrictive licensing, and it was a time when playing a game meant pure pleasure and nothing else. And I think we're pretty far away from that today. I think the monetization and surveillance infrastructure of the modern internet has basically taken root in games, and I don't think we can ever have that very simple relationship and pleasurable relationship that we had with them back then. So I think that creates this strong sense of nostalgia when gaming was quite literally simpler. You didn't have to worry about day one patches or DLC or things like that. And so technology is changing our relationship because to nostalgia, because nostalgia is just longer lasting now. We have this longing for the simpler days of our youth when technological development was, as I said, something that you looked at in a very positive light. But I can go back to my NES and actually pick up the same game that I was playing 20 years ago and play the same save file that I created in the 90s. And I can consume and experience the same games in the same ways that I did when I was 10 years old. That's something fundamentally different, because there is no back in the day anymore in the sense that all these things are lost. No, they're still in my room. They're still hooked up to my television. They have not receded into the past as, say, other kind of memories from your youth. So you can have the same experiences, and you can probably enjoy them from a broader perspective, a perspective of greater maturity and discernment. And this is, of course, to say nothing about the re-releases or compilations, emulation, all of these things that have allowed us to, in a certain sense, stay within this cultural realm that we admired as a kid, or at least travel through it more completely than we could back when we were younger. So, retro gamers obviously have been sharing their passion online, and there's just this endless stream of nostalgia that we can consume on a daily basis. So I would argue that nostalgia isn't really just a yearning for the past in the traditional sense of the word, but it's actually become a lived experience in the present. Nostalgia isn't nostalgia for something that was irrevocably lost to time, but it's actually a nostalgia for something that was incomplete in its own time. And I think, to the credit of game developers and, the games of our youth, because of their craft and their artistry, these games were so rich and so varied and so plentiful that they couldn't be exhausted when we were kids. I think in a certain sense, retro gaming nostalgia, aided and enabled by the modern technological infrastructure in which we live has actually just a continuation of the journey that we started in our youth. And I think there's just so much to experience that it's a journey that can last as long as we want it to last. Insofar as, I don't know about you, but I have not played the entire NES library. I have not played the entire Genesis library. Heck, the 800 games I have in my closet, there's probably a good 350 that I haven't touched or that I've only played for a very limited amount of time. Not to mention the fact that I think nostalgia online and it's on YouTube and other sites means that there will never be an end to this culture if you don't want it to end. So I think that's obviously extremely important when we talk about retro gaming. But I think there's another side to this. And I call this the retro personality. So as much as we want to sort of continue the gaming journeys of our youth, I think at the same time we're kind of oddly answering the call of advertising from that day. What did the advertisers in the video game magazines tell you on the back of the Nintendo and Sega boxes? Tell you, well, you have to buy them all. Please buy them all. And it was actually a financial impossibility to do when we were kids, but now we're obeying the dicta of game advertisement, if you want to look at it that way. And I think it's fair to ask if our impassioned collecting today is nothing more than a delayed form of hyper-consumerism. Are we a middle class aided by technology at a later time pursuing a consumer behavior of an earlier time that was only available to the wealthy? And I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting, because if you had given me, I've always said this, if you had given me 50 grand in 1993, I would have bought the same stuff that I bought in 2011 for a lot less money. So I think there is a pleasure in finally being able to fulfill these consumer dreams that you couldn't fulfill 20, 30 years ago. I think in a related sense, you have to admit that nostalgia is becoming a kind of market segment, or indeed an industry. There's now a nostalgia industry out there, not just for gaming, but for a lot of other products. And so lots of niche products are becoming more and more abundant, and all these companies are asking us to part with more and more of our money to live the dreams of our youth. Now, obviously, a few very prominent examples of that. You had Mike Kennedy's Debacle, the retro VGS Coleco Chameleon. And then, of course, I talked about this a couple episodes ago, the solid gold or the gold-plated NES, was that Analog NT NES unit. So why would you need that? Why would you want that? It's I think, evidence that this is an industry, this is now a market segment. And what we have is a commodification of nostalgia. And it's not just limited to these kind of small-time vendors offering super expensive products, or in Kennedy's case, failed products. I think a lot of it is driven by YouTube personalities, and we know who they are, the Pete Doers and Metal Jesuses of the world, who really in the early life of YouTube leveraged their technological and financial resources to mass produce their own nostalgia. And of course this took off, and so many more people began doing it, and of course that's how I got into the hobby. And it's kind of strange because there's, I would say, kind of market manipulation. And if you listen to these guys, they've admitted as much. They'll talk about a game and it will skyrocket in value. So whether they realize it or not, they got in at the ground floor of collecting, and then through this activity, they've talked up the value of their collections pretty substantially. and they kind of act like, oh, I talked about Star Ocean, and now it's even more expensive, and now it's hard to find on eBay. Isn't that weird? But in the end, I think this, regardless of what they earn off of YouTube, just the press that they're creating, the content they're creating, is itself an investment in the value of their own collection. But put that aside, and just all of this, the expansion of the retro gaming community has kind of created, over the past 2 or 3 years, I think, a homogenization of gaming nostalgia and what I call the emergence of the retro personality, which is just a huge group of people with the same interests, who laugh at the same jokes and relate to the same memes, and who actually share the same memories for the same games. And they all seem to kind of channel that same nostalgia that was put out there a lot earlier. And I'm not saying that they're kind of copying Pete Dorr, things like that, but it's a kind of replication process, and I'm part of it. I'm not saying that I'm above and beyond this. No, I got into it, and it was alluring. But at some point you have to ask yourself, how many guys in gaming t-shirts sitting in front of a shelf of games do we really need? I think that has kind of reached a critical mass at this point. How much farther can it go? And the problem with this kind of, if you want to call it a mass authenticity that everyone is presenting out there, is that it always morphs into its opposite. And so I asked a year ago, can our hobby survive if we just become a market segment? And I don't know. I think the jury is still out on that. But I think the question now is, where do we go from here? How can we meaningfully expand this culture that we've created for ourselves? And my fear is that with this homogenization that's gone on through YouTube, with this kind of mass authenticity of nostalgia, and it's, again, this is not just related to gaming, but we'll keep it in the realm of gaming. I think a lot of voices are being crowded out. I think a lot of content is derivative and, quite frankly, boring. We've heard all the jokes. We've heard all of the memories. We've kind of experienced a lot of what there is to experience out there, and I don't see anyone doing these videos saying anything new or interesting. And it is a shame. And I think this lack of original content is only going to become a bigger problem for the community, at least if we want to produce content that is intellectually interesting and meaningful. One of the problems with the rise of the retro personality is that the content that's being produced now is more or less kind of a standardized, flattened out kind of product. It no longer has that, what I would call that true authenticity that it had at the beginning. And if we don't correct this, if we don't allow for new and interesting voices to kind of come up and engage in the hobby and in the community, I think we're going to be nothing more than kind of whiny pitchmen on YouTube selling this or that, whether it's our own nostalgia or increasingly now some related product to retro gaming. It's sad, and I think there's space for two kinds of voices. I think we need more kind of mature, analytical voices in the retro community, and we need to engage with that sort of content. But also, on the other hand, I actually think if you believe the dates that I'm offering, 2008 being kind of the start of the popularity of the retro gaming community, there's probably a lot of young people who have actually grown up with retro gaming, and I think they need to be promoted. I think it would be really interesting to hear their perspective on the hobby. But as it stands now, those who embody the retro personality, I think, have gotten a little bit lazy, and I think this replicated content that you just see channel after channel, and that is sort of infected, and I will use the term infected, the overall culture is not really sustainable. And I don't think it's malicious. I don't think it's deliberate. I think it's part of the YouTube social media culture that only allows for a very, very specific kind of content to rise to the top. And of course, it's the most profitable as far as clicks go. But I've always seen the retro gaming community to be something more than just another social media group, and engaged in something more than just blatant self-promotion. And if we're going to go in that sort of direction of self-promotion, recycled derivative content, all centered around nostalgia, I actually think we're going to develop, strangely, actual traditional nostalgia, which is that we will have a fundamental break with the past. Because I think if we're sort of seeing retro gaming as kind of a side business, as some of us do, then we've lost the magic that we had as a kid. And it doesn't matter if we've got the SNES in the room, our relationship to these cultural products has changed if they just become a kind of, I don't know, secondary revenue stream, or for some people, primary revenue stream. We've gone in a totally different direction from, I think, a lot of the reasons that people started this online community to begin with. And so, in a strange way, it's actually, I think we'll have actually grown up if we turn retro gaming into a small business. Which is not to say that people can't make money off of their videos or kind of sell useful hardware tweaks or things like that. That's always been part of the community. But, like I said, with the lack of sophistication, with the homogenization of content, we risk becoming what a lot of other YouTubers and YouTube communities are, essentially an advertisement arm for this or that product or this or that company. And I would hate to see the community that I've really engaged with for all these years become pure marketing. And I think we have to fight against that so we can maintain what it is that makes retro gaming so wonderful. Alright, and welcome to This Month in Gaming, and I've selected a fairly somber moment in the history of gaming, and that is June 2001. And I think this works perfectly in this episode entitled A Millennial's Lament, because I think this arguably was a time frame in which what a lot of people consider to be the retro era ended and the modern era began. I don't subscribe to that. I consider retro, and we have a functional definition of retro, which I've talked about, which is simply to say, hey, retro games are games for systems which are no longer being produced. But a lot of people believe that the retro era died with the Dreamcast, and I see why they say that. It's there's a lot of good sort of cultural arguments for that, but for me personally, this really was the end of my childhood and kind of a pause in my kind of gaming journey, and a pause that I did not recover from for a number of years, actually. So 2001, let's paint the picture, personally and then historically. I think it's hard for a lot of people to imagine a world before 9/11. And for me, and I don't know how other listeners feel who are around the same age or in their mid-30s, but 9/11 was really a time when I think life in America changed drastically, and we're still feeling the implications of that change. I'm not going to get political or linger on the history, but definitely the world after that point seemed very different than the history leading up to it. And as far as gaming goes, again, I'm not saying that, the landscape of gaming mimics the world historical landscape of pre- and post-9/11. That's not the point. But at least personally, I was at a transitional point in gaming, and I think the industry was at a transitional point as well. So in June 2001, we had a mix of releases that kind of straddled the old and the new. And it's very interesting. In June of 2001, I had applied, well, I guess not in June, but at some point I had applied to go to this college program in Berlin. And in June, I found out that I was accepted, and I was going to spend July and August in Berlin. Now, at this point, how old am I? I can't remember. Let's say I was a 18-year-old kid, 19-year-old kid, and I had an apartment lined up. It was great. 2 months, completely paid for, as far as living expenses anyway, in Berlin. This was before the Euro, just before the Euro. Things were super cheap, and I was so excited. Couldn't wait to get over there. So, June of 2001, I was preparing, and I'd already started college, and as I started college, my gaming time was reduced, and I talked about this on some YouTube episode. I kind of got into this kick where I said, gaming is not a part of my life anymore. I kind of felt like when I got to college, in the States anyway, that I just was sort of moving away from gaming. And it was so funny because when I first got to university, I had gotten there early, and I didn't need the advisors to show me where to how to take a book out of the library. So I kind of ditched all of that, and I spent a lot of time playing Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in the student union, which was totally unoccupied. This little arcade, no one was ever in it, and I think games were like a quarter or something. So I started off playing games at college, but then I eventually moved away from it. And I recall June of 2001, the PlayStation 2 had come out, but there were still a lot of releases for the PS1, for the Dreamcast, and you could kind of see those systems going by the wayside. So as I'm waiting to go off to Berlin, I'm kind of following the releases still, and maybe I was going to the mall with my friends and looking around GameStops and whatever they were called back then, Software, etc., and EB Games or whatever. And I kind of recall that I was sort of drawn to some of these older games that had come out, and also intrigued by the PlayStation 2, but I felt like I was just drifting away from gaming. So, give you an idea of a couple of the releases. You had Sonic Adventure 2 for the Dreamcast, so again, a very late release on the Dreamcast. You had a couple PS1 games that were still trickling out. You had a lot of GBA games this month, and you had a couple PS2 games. And I felt almost sad because I look at these Game Boy Advance releases. Not a system that I had, but you had Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Super Mario Advance, Earthworm Jim, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, Konami Crazy Riders, and a Bomberman game, Bomberman Tournament, I believe. That came out later in the month. And as a huge fan of the SNES era, I remember seeing these games and some of the, obviously in the store, looking at the back of the boxes. They had a kiosk set up here and there. And I was, I would really, part of me really wants to play these games. These look like awesome old school games. But I also felt, this is too kiddie. I can't buy this Game Boy Advance. And I'm not going to show up at my college in Berlin, people from all over the world. I'm going to be like the doofus with the Game Boy Advance. So I'm not going to do that. Sonic Adventure 2 looked really, really good. I saw it in the store, and I have friends who had it. And then, of course, you had Final Fantasy Chronicles, which I believe had Chrono Trigger, and I think Final Fantasy 4, if I remember. So that looked incredible. And, yeah, I knew that there had been some PlayStation 2 games that had come out earlier in the month, or I guess late last month. Red Faction, and then this month you had Twisted Metal Black. And I guess I read about those, and of course PlayStation 2 was tantalizing new technology with the DVD player. But I couldn't bring myself to buy any of these games, and it was only until later in life that I discovered them. Let me tell you something, this June 2001 Game Boy Advanced lineup is really fabulous. Gosh, if I probably didn't have, I don't know how much Game Boy Advanced games cost back in those days, but I didn't have the money to spend on any of this, and since I was going away, I was being kind of frugal before the trip. But over the years, I have played some of these games. I'll start off with Castlevania Circle of the Moon. I loved Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation 1. It was one of the first games that I got, and I just played the heck out of it. Loved every minute of it, loved the kind of RPG elements that have been built in, because really, Castlevania, I grew up playing Castlevania, renting it, but it never really grabbed me in the way that Symphony of the Night did, and I always wanted to play sequels to that, but they never came out, at least on the home console. However, on the Game Boy Advance, this Circle of the Moon is a terrific game. It really captures the feeling of Symphony of the Night so perfectly. It is a magnificent game. The castle feels very big. I have to say that I discovered this through emulation, I guess, back in the mid-2000s, maybe late 2000s, whenever the Game Boy emulation became kind of stable. And then I picked up a copy at some point, a loose copy, which was actually great because I could play it on the Retron 5, and that's pretty awesome. I love this game. Love the music. Terrific soundtrack. I'll play some of it here in the interludes. And just, I couldn't tell you how much fun I had with that game. I think it's one of the best sort of portable Castlevania games, but then again, they've come out with a lot. This is the only one I played. I know there was another one, or two on the GBA, and then there was a string of 3 on the DS, and I played the Portrait of Ruin on the DS, which is also very good. So if you like Castlevania, this is a great place to start, and then explore the other ones on the system and the DS. Super Mario Advanced was, I think, Mario 2 and the original Mario Brothers. Lots of fun. Great little port of those games, just those great crisp SNES-style graphics. I didn't play Earthworm Jim. F-Zero Maximum Velocity, though, again, another, if you loved the Super NES F-Zero, which I definitely was a huge fan of, this is a great follow-up to that. Great music. It's everything that you want. And, of course, again, playing it discovering it on emulation, which means I was playing it on a computer screen, and now on the Retron 5. I guess it's a little different experience because I'm getting the full screen effect. I don't know what it would have been like to play this, I guess, on a non-backlit early 2000s LCD screen, but just really, really nice looking game. And then Konami Crazy Riders, which I only discovered a few years ago. Someone talked about it. I can't remember where I heard about it, but it's basically the Konami version of Mario Kart, and really competent game, a great Mario Kart clone with some fun Konami characters. I mean, if I can play as Ganbare Goemon in a US release, I'm a happy camper. So, and again, great music, great graphics on that, and I could just, I was saying to myself, as I discovered these games over the years, a Bomberman Tournament, kind of a RPG-style Bomberman, almost like a Pokemon-style Bomberman with a nice overworld. If I had purchased this system and purchased even one or two of these games back then, I would have been so happy. But I was getting older and maybe a little elitist and thinking that, oh, well, I'm not a kid anymore, so I'm just going to move on. And hey, you're in college, discovering girls and socializing, especially in Europe. It's a lot of different things to occupy your attention. But Sonic Adventure 2 is a game that I don't like. I as much as I love the visual style of Sonic Adventure and some of the later kind of 3D Sonic games on the GameCube, I think they play like garbage. And Sonic Adventure 2 is probably the best of those games. But I never felt like sort of transitioning Sonic to that 3D straight ahead plane really worked, because I felt like the platforming just was not accurate. So it was trying to both be on rails and give you a little freedom, and it just was so twitchy. The controls were so twitchy, it just didn't work out. Of course, this game starts with the famous sequence of Sonic running away from the truck, and it has some kind of, I don't know what genre of music, but it's kind of poppy type music, and obviously you're playing as some of the other characters. But the other thing that was so bad about the 3D Sonic games is the attempt to sort of cram in a story, and the voice acting is so bad. So this is an interesting kind of curiosity as a late release Dreamcast game, but I didn't like it. And I played it at a friend's house back then, and again saw it in a store, didn't like it. And I had played one of the Xbox Live Arcade releases a couple of years ago and was not a fan. Now, the PlayStation 1, Final Fantasy Chronicles, I had Final Fantasy Anthology. I thought they did a great job with that. I didn't even know they had released this back then, but yeah, to get Chrono Trigger and another Final Fantasy game, that would have been great. And then, of course, it's funny, if you look at what was coming up in July of 2001, you got a real heavy hitter on the PlayStation 2, which I actually remember kind of looking at and being really intrigued by, and that was Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, which I still have never played. I have to get my hands on that. Final Fantasy X launched in Japan I guess in July, kind of mid-July. So the gaming landscape was changing, and I always thought, God, June 2001, when I went back and looked at it, this was a kind of interesting overlap between eras. And I'm kind of sad that I didn't discover it back in the day. So to end my personal story, I went off to Europe July and August, and I was with students from all these different countries. We're all living in Berlin, East Berlin, which at that time still hadn't been really redeveloped. And I mean, we were far out in East Berlin, but Berlin nonetheless. And this was like a political science, IR type summer school. So a lot of talk about America's role in the world, and I think at that point they had just elected a young President Putin in Russia, and what were the global politics going to be? It was so funny. There was this kid from Oxford, and he was quite the prodigy in international relations, and we were having a beer one night, and he said, at some point, Britain's going to vote to leave the European Union, and I think it's going to happen. And then 10 or 15 years later, they're going to become the 51st state in the United States. And I said, oh, man, you're crazy. What's happening? Britain's voting on the 23rd, I think, of this month. So see if his prognostication was right. But also people from the Middle East. And I remember I had a really nice friendship with a guy from Tunisia, with a guy from Libya. And we were kind of talking about, it was so funny because their whole thing, one of the things that they were interested in was improving relations between the Middle East and the United States. And we were kind of, young, idealistic teenagers in college. We're thinking, well, how could we accomplish this? And they had a whole roadmap of stuff that they wanted to do. And then you come home, got home at the end of August, got back to campus here in the U.S., and I'll never forget, I was, the morning of September 11th, I had left my room, and a kid calls me and is like, I've never seen him before, is like, grabs him by the arms, is like, you got to come in and watch this. And obviously the events played out, and I went to the dining hall afterwards, kind of in shock. And they would always give us a free New York Times. And I remember the front page of the New York Times, I think it was talking about the presidential election in Mexico and the candidates for mayor of New York. And then the next day they started with their coverage, obviously September 12th, A Nation Challenged. So never heard from those guys, those Middle Eastern guys in Europe again, and I just kind of felt like the world, even this sort of positive world, this positive kind of atmosphere at this college in Berlin, with all the people kind of plotting out this wonderful, globally connected, integrated future, like it felt like that was lost in a way. And then as time went on, I kind of saw like, the techno-optimism that we had. Like everyone was afraid of Y2K, and when that didn't happen, and the tech bubble burst, and this kind of technological panacea that I think naively a lot of people in my high school kind of growing up as 2000 was approaching, like the bubble had burst on that as well, and we knew things were going to be just a little bit more complicated in the world and in the tech world, and things maybe wouldn't play out as wonderfully as it was presented to us in school. So yeah, just looking back on these games in June and thinking, being pulled at the one hand by my kind of love of retro games to, maybe I should get these games, get this system, to no, I feel like I'm moving on, the world is moving on, I've got to move on with it. It was just really a time that I look back on, and one of the more interesting moments in my life from a variety of perspectives. All right, it's time for Games of the Month, and I'm going to start off with a sports game. And this is a game that I've been playing now for quite a few weeks, Pro Evolution Soccer 2016, which is a Konami game. And if you've been following me, I've said that I'm not going to support Konami in any way, shape, or form, but I found the game used for a reasonable price. And I really did believe that after PES 2015, they couldn't get much better. But I was wrong, because PES 2016 is an absolutely terrific game, and it really is one of my favorite game series of all time. sports or otherwise. So what does this game do differently than 2015? Well, a couple of things. The action is a little bit more intense. I'm getting a sense that there's more of a midfield struggle for possession and for kind of a tactical advantage, which I think is a response to FIFA 2016 having done that as well. But they also include this year the editing suite, so you can actually create real teams, the teams that are missing, which is fairly easy to do. And actually, I have to say that there are a lot of sites that will actually give you all of the assets in order to create, say, teams from the Bundesliga or from the Barclays Premier League. So it's just a fuller package in that regard, graphically amazing, and the gameplay, while, as I said, a little bit more defensive, a little bit more unpredictable, a system that this year kind of emphasizes not only the fact that your players fatigue at a certain rate, but how that fatigue affects their ball handling. Things like that have been tweaked, but still the tremendous gameplay that has been a constant in the series. This is a series that does everything right, and that I think maintains a retro feel. It's not trying to look overly realistic, and strangely, I think the lack of licenses, in a way, lends it that arcade kind of quality to it, that classic arcade quality, almost like you would have found on the Dreamcast, with those kind of crisp, bold, clean graphics, and some of the most amazing gameplay you'll find. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about this series, something that has been around for as long as I've been playing it, which goes back for me to the original Xbox, is that the gameplay and the way that plays develop is so fluid. And now that you can have that experience in 60 FPS, 1080p, it's pretty incredible. You have a sense of freedom and creativity in this game that you simply do not have in, I would argue, any other sports game, at least any other sports game that I've played. And while there are sort of canned animations for basic moves like running and celebrating and things like that, the overall fluidity of your attack feels different each time you maintain possession of the ball for long enough. I mean, you can pull off some incredible through passes, crosses. Each goal feels different and unique and earned in a way that it doesn't feel in FIFA. There's something special about this game, and I know that for a lot of people, sports games are kind of just on the outskirts of the hobby and don't even really count as good video games, but when you get outside of the EA approach to gaming, or sports gaming, which is to develop an engine and milk it for 10 years, and you see something like this game running, I guess it's really running on a new engine. Technically, I think it's on the Fox engine, but it just kind of adds to the great foundation that existed since, for me, the Xbox. I think it originally came out in 95 on the PlayStation. I've never played that version of it, but it's adaptable. It's kind of difficult enough when you set it to kind of the higher difficulty settings and extend the match time, where it is really a battle and it feels like, wow, I've really earned a victory. And then when you drill it down and put it on its more arcadey settings, it's a great, quick, fast-paced game of soccer that's actually more exciting in many instances than watching real soccer. And you get an appreciation for the sport through the game in a way that you may not get watching it on television. And I think that's what the great sports games do. They give you a perspective on the sports that they represent, and it kind of pulls you in to the actual sport. And this game does that incredibly well. Players feel unique and different, whether you're controlling Messi, quick, intelligent, tactical passer with a lethal shot, versus some pure striker like Lewandowski on Bayern and stuff like that. Really well done. Great facial animations for the star players in World Soccer, but everything else looks just crisp and bold. It's really really impressive what they did here, and it feels like this game was a passion project. I mean, Konami is obviously less than a shell of their former selves, but yeah, you just get the feel like whoever is responsible for this game really said, hey, it's the, I think, 20th anniversary of the franchise. We're just gonna go crazy with this, and we're gonna have a blast, and it'll be almost like our last hurrah. We'll give the fans everything that they want and create a truly, I would actually say, magical sports game. And they've done that, and I think it just often gets passed over by video game fans, but if you can be a little bit more open-minded and give the game a shot and realize you're not getting a standardized, derivative, boring EA product, and you really have a game that was developed from the ground up to be great, this is the one. And used for $20, I would definitely take a chance on it. 2015 is also very good, which is probably even cheaper, but you just can't create teams and players and uniforms and things like that. Both tremendous games, and actually probably the games I play the most on the PlayStation 4. So I wholeheartedly recommend this one. It's almost like a throwback to the good old days of sports games, and perhaps one of the last Pro Evolution games that Konami will put out. So next up, we'll jump from a sports game to a couple of racing games. Now, in the past, I would say 3 or 4 years, certainly on PC, but also on console, we've had some really terrific racing games. However, they've all been car racing games, and we haven't really had a standout motorcycle racing title. The other day, I kind of thought to myself, I would be interested in riding a motorcycle. I don't know why. I've never particularly had this desire, but I was driving through a town kind of about 15-20 minutes away, and I noticed that there was a bike shop that either I hadn't particularly paid attention to or that was new. It looked fairly new. And they had some, I guess, Kawasaki and Suzuki bikes. And I'd always kind of been a fan of European motorcycle racing and the Ducati brand and stuff like that. I kind of got into it when I was living in Europe. So I figured, I don't know, kind of interesting to see what riding a motorcycle is like. I've only ever ridden a power scooter, stuff like that, over in Europe. So I looked into it, and of course, my state makes it very difficult to get one of these endorsements on your license. You gotta go to this 3-day class, and it's pretty much like 24 hours over 3 days, and a whole bunch of red tape, stuff like that. So I don't really have the time to pursue that. Plus, I don't know. I don't really have anywhere to go with the bike if I were to get one. So I figured I'd do the next best thing and play some motorcycle racing games. And of course, like I said, there's really nothing that's come out recently except for a game called Ride, which has gotten some pretty bad reviews. I haven't really picked that up. So I went back to my collection, and I did have some motorcycle racing games. Now, the first one I kind of discovered through the Retro Gaming Roundup podcast, and then they were talking about great racing circuits. And Mike James, one of the hosts from England, talked about the Isle of Man TT, which I had not learned anything about. I guess what was more popular was like MotoGP. So I knew more about that aspect of motorcycle racing, but I guess the Isle of Man, a little island between, I guess, Northern Ireland and England, sort of a semi-independent protectorate. of Britain. Anyway, they do a motorcycle race where they basically close down the whole island and turn it into several different racing circuits. So he had mentioned that there was a game called TT Superbikes Railroad Racing. And I had picked that up very cheap a while ago, but never really got around to playing it. So I pulled that out of the collection. In fact, I didn't even realize that it was about this Isle of Man racing tournament. And this, surprisingly, is a really good game. I picked it up for maybe $4 or $5 on eBay not that long ago, maybe a couple months ago. And I was really surprised by how well it played. This is a very old game. 2000, I shouldn't say very old, but 2005. It's not an early PlayStation game, but it feels like that from the menus. It's very kind of clunky. It takes forever to really do anything and to load into the race. But once you do, it plays very, it's very crisp. It plays very well. There's a couple of points that I'm not crazy about. The first is the lighting. The lighting in the game, I think they were trying to play with sort of, not really a day-night cycle, but basically what happens is this race on the Isle of Man is broken down into stages, and I guess as the day progresses, they tried to give you shadows and kind of odd light to deal with as you're sort of going through the mountainous regions on this island. It makes it very hard to see. The contrast between the shadows is such that you really struggle to see what's going on. And that makes it very difficult. And it's already a fairly difficult game. Of course, if you take all the assists off, it becomes extremely challenging. But between the lighting and the fact that it's going to take you several clicks and a lot of waiting to load in to some of these races, it can be a little irritating. But what it does really well is kind of capture the intensity of this particular race. So there's no other tracks. It's just all, you're traveling this island, and you'll race like 4 or 5 stages in a particular area. And having not really followed this particular race, I don't know how accurate it is, although Mike James was saying it was pretty accurate. But what it does so well, I guess I've been reading up about this race, is that it's on residential streets, some very narrow streets, curbs, strange twists and turns, and a lot of like garden walls and stuff like that. And the game is very difficult. It forces you really to go full throttle, all out, and those obstacles come into play. If you hit a curb incorrectly, I mean, you're going to go flying. And the collisions are actually, for this time on the PlayStation 2, pretty advanced. It looks pretty good, and it gives you that sort of white knuckle feeling, like, you know, if I want to place in a particular race, I just need to be at the limit the whole time. So it's really a surprisingly good motorcycle racing game. There was a sequel, which was a very late release on the PlayStation, I think like 2009. And I did pick that up as well because, like I said, this game was about $3 or $4, and the other one was also about $3 or $4. So for $8 to get both of these games, pretty good. I didn't really play the other one so much, haven't gotten to it. I maybe popped it in for 10 minutes, very similar to this. But if you can find this, I would say for under $10, if you have any interest in motorcycle racing, very good game. TT Superbikes Railroad Racing. And it kind of made me think, you know, I was enjoying that, at least on track, more than a motorcycle racing game that I had picked up quite some time ago on the PlayStation 2, and that is Tourist Trophy. And Tourist Trophy is Gran Turismo with motorcycles. So it seems like a great sort of extension of what Gran Turismo is. And yet, I remember not really being into it And after I played this one, I had to go back to Tourist Trophy. And yeah, I still am not a fan. What I don't like about Tourist Trophy is that it is extremely technical. Even if you have some of the assists on and you're assigning front and rear braking to one button, and you've got the the automatic transmission instead of the manual transmission, there's a lot of weight shifting you have to do. There's a lot of speed management through the corners, and because if you take a corner the wrong way, you will pay in Tourist Trophy, or if you take it too slow, or if your angle is off, I mean, you'll just, even going like 20 miles an hour, you'll fall off your bike. Very kind of odd and demanding. And it hasn't gotten any better with time. I will say that the licensing system, and this was old school Gran Turismo, where if you wanted to play in the higher end races, you had to have your license. And there were just a ton of licensing challenges here, but they were not bad. They were actually, in some cases, more fun to play than the actual races, especially like the one-on-one races that you're doing with other people. The game forces you to really memorize these tracks and be so precise. Now, I guess as a real motorcycle rider, there's a lot that goes into it, and precision is required. I just wish that they gave you a more arcadey feel, because one of the things that I think this game suffers from is that you never really get the sense of pure speed. And the Superbike TT Isle of Man game does give you that. It gives you the sensation of riding at the limits of control. This one, even if you're on a higher level bike like some of the Ducatis or the higher end Suzukis, you don't really have the sense of blistering speed. And I think that's part of motorcycle racing, and certainly if you go online and you sort of type in any of these bikes, and you'll see people riding them with the kind of action cams, and man, the sense of speed is incredible. So I like the attention to detail. I always have loved Gran Turismo's sort of collectible element where you're trying to earn all of these vehicles, and I would like to go back to this, but I just found that after a while, Tourist Trophy, despite its great look